It's funny the things you remember, the things that stick with you, you know. Like, out of all the days of my life, it's that one freaking Tuesday in July of '84 that's just burned into my brain. I can still feel the sun baking down on my shoulders, the grit of the trail dust in my teeth, the way my horse Dixie was acting up. Just thinking about it now, my stomach kind of clenches up. We used to ride out to the old Florida East Coast railway tracks all the time. Me and Carol, my best friend back then. We were both, maybe 15, 16. Summers were endless back then. No school, just freedom, sunshine and horses. Port Juniper was a sleepy town even then. Nothing much ever happened, which was probably why we got ourselves into this mess in the first place. Just bored teenagers looking for something, anything to do. The tracks weren't in use anymore, not really. Or I guess they were technically still there, but overgrown, barely visible in places, weeds and scrubby palmetto bushes pushing up through the gravel. It wasn't exactly a scenic ride, more like riding through a dusty green tunnel, the woods crowding in on both sides. But we liked it. It was quiet, felt a million miles away from everything, even though we were probably only a couple of miles outside of town. Seemed wild, I guess, in our teenage minds. That day was hotter than hell, even for Florida in July. The kind of heat that just sits on you, heavy and wet, like you're wearing a damp blanket. The air was still, not a breeze, and everything just shimmered in that thick, hazy heat. We'd ridden out early, hoping to beat the worst of it, but by mid-morning it was already brutal. Sweat was dripping down my back, soaking my shirt, and Dixie was lathered up, but she loved to run, so we kept going. We were just kind of ambling along, talking about boys and music, stupid stuff teenagers talk about when it hit us. The smell, I mean, just bam, like a wall. It was the worst smell I've ever smelled in my life, and I've smelled some bad things, living on a farm and all. But this was different. It was like something dead, something rotten, but something else too. Like decay, but mixed with, I don't even know, something chemical maybe, or metallic, sickly sweet and sour all at once, nauseating. It made your eyes water and your throat close up. We both reined up, horses fidgeting. Jesus, Carol coughed, pinching her nose. What in the hell is that? I wrinkled my nose, trying to breathe through my mouth. Dead animal, maybe? Stuck in the woods? But it was too strong for just a dead raccoon or something. Way too strong. And it wasn't just the smell, it was like the woods changed. The sounds, I mean. Normally out there you hear birds, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves, that kind of stuff. But all of a sudden it went quiet, like dead quiet. And then you started hearing other things, snapping, cracking, like heavy branches breaking. But it wasn't like wind breaking branches, it was deliberate, heavy, like something big moving through the woods, and not trying to be quiet about it, just moving, crashing through the undergrowth. Dixie started acting up then. She was normally pretty calm, nothing much spooked her, but she started prancing sideways, head up, ears twitching. She whinnied, a nervous, high-pitched sound, and tried to pull back on the reins. Carol's horse, a big Appaloosa gelding named Chief, started doing the same thing, tossing his head and stomping. They were both spooked, big time. You could feel it, the tension in their muscles, the way they were breathing, short and fast. Maybe we should turn around, Carol said, voice shaky. She was looking around, eyes wide, scanning the woods. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to get freaked out too. That smell, those sounds, it wasn't right. It felt wrong, like we were somewhere we shouldn't be. But I didn't want to be a chicken. Nah, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Probably just a deer or something. Come on, let's just keep going a little further. Stupid teenage pride, you know? Trying to act tough. We kicked the horses forward again, but they were reluctant, edgy. They kept looking back towards the woods, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring, smelling the air. The snapping and crashing in the woods kept pace with us, moving along, just inside the trees, hidden from sight. Whatever it was definitely following us. And it was big, too big to be a deer, and deer don't smell like that. Then we heard the other sound, the gravel sound, like footsteps, but not human footsteps. Heavier and paced, like something walking on two legs, but wrong. Clumsy almost, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs, like it was heavy, dragging its feet. "Carol, did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely a squeak. My heart started hammering in my chest, pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. She nodded, eyes huge. "Yeah. What is that?" I thought it was her. I thought it was Carol walking too close to the tracks, being careless. "Carol, stay away from the tracks," I snapped, turning my head to look at her to tell her to be careful. That's when I saw it. It wasn't Carol. Carol was right beside me on Chief, white as a sheet, eyes locked on something down the tracks, frozen still, and then I followed her gaze, and I saw it. Jesus God, I will never, ever forget what I saw in that moment as long as I live. It's burned into my memory like a brand. It's right there, behind my eyelids every time I close my eyes. Even now, typing this out, I can see it. Down the tracks, maybe 150 yards away, where the tracks curved around a bend and disappeared into a thicker patch of woods, there was something standing on the tracks. Well, not exactly standing, more like hunched over, crouching. It was tall. Even hunched over, it looked tall. Taller than a man, and skinny. But not skinny like someone who's just thin. Skinny like emaciated, like skin stretched over bone. It was hard to see clearly because of the heat haze shimmering in the air and the shadows from the trees, but I could make out shapes, a body shape, humanoid, but twisted, wrong. It was covered in hair, reddish-brown hair, kind of matted and greasy-looking, long hair hanging down in clumps, and its limbs. Jesus, its limbs were long, too long. Its arms reached almost to the ground even when it was crouched, and its legs, they just looked wrong, bent at weird angles, too long and spindly, like a spider's legs. It was crouched over, facing away from us at first, like it was looking at something on the tracks, or maybe eating something. I don't know. My mind was just blank, frozen, stuck on the image of this thing. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it straightened up, rising up, unfolding like some kind of insect. And it turned its head, slowly, deliberately, like it knew we were there, like it had been waiting for us to see it. And then I saw its eyes. Even from that distance, even in the dappled sunlight, I saw its eyes, dark, black. But they weren't just black, they glowed, not like bright, shining light, more like a deep internal glow, like burning embers deep inside dark sockets. They locked on us, locked right on us, and I felt it. I felt something coming from those eyes, something cold, something hungry, terror, pure, raw, ice-cold terror. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything else just disappeared. The heat, the dust, the smell, the sounds of the woods, Carol beside me, everything just vanished, and there was only that thing and those eyes burning into me. Dixie went ballistic. She screamed, a real scream of terror, and reared up on her hind legs, fighting the bit, twisting and plunging. Chief did the same, mirroring her panic. They were both terrified, out of their minds with fear. Their instincts, their animal instincts, were screaming danger, screaming run. And that's what we did. We didn't say a word. We didn't even look at each other. We just turned and ran. We kicked those horses, spurred them, yanked on the reins, anything to make them go, to make them run faster, to get us away from that thing. We didn't care about falling off, didn't care about anything except getting away. The horses bolted, thank God. They were more scared than we were, I think. They knew something was horribly wrong. They tore off down the trail, hooves pounding on the dirt, branches whipping past our faces, the wind screaming in our ears. I don't even remember the ride back. It's just a blur, just the frantic pounding of hooves, the desperate gasps for breath, the roaring in my ears, the image of those eyes burned into my brain. We rode like demons, like the hounds of hell were chasing us. We didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't look back. We just rode. We didn't stop until we were back at the stables, back in the familiar smells of hay and horses and manure, back where it was safe, or safer anyway. We slid off the horses, legs shaking so bad we could barely stand. The horses were heaving, lathered in sweat, nostrils flared, eyes still wide with fear. We just stood there for a minute, leaning against the horses, trying to catch our breath, trying to get our legs to work again. Then Carol started to cry, just silent tears streaming down her face. I think I was crying too, but I couldn't feel it. I was just numb. Finally, Carol choked out, "What was that, Bethany?" Her voice was a whisper, hoarse and trembling. I just shook my head. I didn't know. I didn't have any words. I just had the image, the smell, the feeling of wrongness. We never went back to the tracks after that. Never. Not even close. We sold our horses a few months later, said we'd grown out of riding, lost interest. That wasn't true, of course, but we couldn't explain why we didn't want to ride anymore. Couldn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. We never talked about it again, Carol and me. Not really. We drifted apart eventually, like teenage friendships do. But I always knew, and I'm sure she did too, that it wasn't just growing apart. It was that thing. It changed something in us. Something fundamental. Sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I still smell it. That awful, sickening smell. And I see those eyes, those glowing, dark eyes, and I feel that cold, paralyzing fear all over again. I don't know what it was. I have no explanation. Monster, demon, some kind of creature, something lost, something ancient, something that shouldn't be. I have no idea. And I don't want to know. I really, truly never want to know. I hope I never see it again. Ever. And sometimes, when I'm really quiet and really still, I think I can still hear it. In the rustle of the leaves, in the snap of a twig, in the silence of the night. Just beyond the edge of hearing, those heavy, clumsy footsteps moving through the woods, still out there, waiting. Story 2. Okay, so this is going to sound totally insane, I know. I've debated with myself for years whether to even put this out there, actually type it up and let it float around in the internet ether. But something keeps nagging at me, like a low-grade fever that just won't break. And I found this space, I guess. And it felt like maybe here, of all places, people might actually get it, or at least not immediately write me off as some nut job. It happened a long time ago, back in the summer of '68. No, wait, scratch that. It was definitely summer, blazing hot, but it was earlier. 1960. Yeah, 1960. I remember because Kennedy was still just a candidate, and everyone at home was glued to the TV whenever he was on, debating whether he was too young, too Catholic, blah, blah, blah. I was just a kid, maybe 7, something around there. And my family, we were taking a summer vacation, piling into our old Ford Fairlane, the one that was about the size of a boat and about as subtle, heading down to Florida. This was before Disney World, way before, when Florida was still mostly swamp and orange groves and retirement homes. The drive itself was an endurance test. No AC in that tank of a car, just the windows down and the wind whipping your hair around, feeling like you were sticking your head in front of a furnace. My dad, he'd chain-smoke Pall Malls the whole way, the windows barely cracking enough to clear out some of the haze, and me and my sister would be crammed in the back seat, sweating buckets, sticky and miserable. We were probably fighting, kids fight, right? My mum would try to keep the peace, handing out crackers and lukewarm sodas from a cooler that sweated worse than we did. But I loved road trips, even back then. I was a super curious kid, always looking out the window, trying to take everything in. Trees, houses, billboards, cows, anything that moved or was just there. And Florida was like another planet to a kid from up north. Everything was green, so green it almost hurt your eyes. Big, droopy trees with leaves like dinner plates, weird birds screeching in the air, and the smell. God, the smell. A thick, damp, earthy smell that was totally different from anything I knew. We were driving somewhere down south. I don't even remember exactly where, maybe Naples, maybe further. But I know we were on Alligator Alley. Even the name sounded exciting to a kid. Alligator Alley. It was this long, straight stretch of road that cut right through the Everglades. Flat as a pancake, just highway and swamp as far as you could see in either direction. Back then, it felt like the end of the earth. Not like now, I guess they've built it up some. But then it was just wild. I was bored, naturally. The novelty of the trip had worn off. The endless green had become monotonous. So I was doing what any bored kid would do. I was hanging my head out the window, feeling the rush of air on my face, letting it dry the sweat, and, honestly, just trying to get a better look at everything. My mom would yell at me to get back inside, said it was dangerous, but I'd just sneak it out again as soon as she wasn't looking. Rebellion of a 7-year-old, you know? We were driving, and the landscape was just blurring past. Sawgrass, cypress trees, the occasional flash of water. And then I saw something that made me sit up straight. Off to the side of the road, maybe 150 feet, maybe a little more, tucked back in amongst some scrubby bushes and skinny trees. There was something. It was hard to see clearly because of the heat shimmer coming off the road and the distance, but it was definitely there. It wasn't moving. That was the first thing that struck me. Everything else was moving. The car, the trees flashing by, even the air seemed to be vibrating with heat. But this thing was just still. I squinted, trying to get a better look. It was tall, that was for sure. Taller than a man, taller than the bushes around it. And it was standing upright, like perfectly upright. Not leaning, not slouching, just straight up and down like a telephone pole. The color was brownish, like a muddy brown, or maybe a cocoa brown. Hard to say for sure in that light and at that distance. It was a dark brown, though, dark and organic looking somehow. Not like wood or dirt, but like skin. My dad was driving fast. We were probably doing 60, 70, something like that. So things were whipping by. But I kept my eyes glued to this thing. We were getting closer, and I could start to make out more details, even though they weren't really details at all. More like impressions. It was shapeless. Not exactly shapeless, but undefined. It didn't have sharp edges or clear lines. It was just this big brown mass. And it was tall, really tall. I remember thinking even then that it was too tall to be a person. It had to be at least 8, maybe 9 feet tall, maybe even taller. And then I saw its head, or what I thought was its head. It wasn't really a head, not like a human head. It was just the top of the brown mass. There was no neck. That's what really struck me. No neck. It was like its head, if it even had one, just sat right on top of its shoulders. Or where its shoulders would have been, if it had shoulders. It was hard to tell. And then, the eyes. That's when I really froze. It had eyes. 2 of them, dark, black maybe, and they were looking right at me. Even from that distance I could feel them, like they were locking onto mine. It was like time slowed down, everything else faded away, and it was just me and those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, they weren't like deer eyes or cow eyes or dog eyes. They were different. They were intelligent, but not friendly. They were intense, penetrating, like they were looking right through me, seeing everything I was thinking, everything I was feeling. I remember feeling this weird calm, not scared, not exactly. More like hypnotized, like I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to. And honestly, I didn't want to. I was just fascinated, mesmerized by this thing. We were still moving, of course. The car was roaring, the wind was screaming in my ears, but all I could see was those eyes. Getting closer, then getting further away as we drove past. And then we were past it. It was behind us, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I twisted around in my seat, leaning over my sister, craning my neck to look out the back window. My mom yelled at me again, told me to sit down and stop making trouble. But I didn't listen. I had to keep looking. Through the back window, shrinking smaller and smaller, I could still see it, standing there motionless in the heat and the green, watching us go. Those dark eyes, even at that distance, still there. We drove on and on, miles and miles, and finally, I couldn't see it anymore. It was gone, swallowed up by the green wilderness. I sat back in my seat, kind of dazed. My sister was probably poking me or something, being annoying, but I don't even remember. My mind was still back there on the side of the road with that thing. At the time, honestly, I didn't think too much about it. We had just come from the Miami Zoo a couple of days before. I'd seen all sorts of crazy animals there, gorillas, orangutans, all kinds of monkeys. My 7-year-old brain just kind of slotted this thing into that category. Some kind of weird ape, maybe. Something escaped from the zoo, or maybe just some strange Florida animal I didn't know about. I figured it was probably something exotic and cool, like everything else in Florida seemed to be to me back then. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my parents, not my sister. Just didn't seem that important at the time. We were on vacation. There were beaches to see, and amusement parks, and fancy hotels with swimming pools. A weird brown thing in the swamp? Meh. Just another Florida oddity, I guess. Life went on. We finished our vacation, drove back home. School started again. Years passed. I grew up, went to college, got a job, got married, had kids of my own. The memory of that trip to Florida faded, like old photographs turning yellow in a box in the attic. I'd think about it sometimes vaguely, just as a kid's memory of a hot car ride and being bored. The thing was just a footnote, if even that. The wood knocks, the howls, the heavy breathing outside the trailer, and those eyes, those glowing yellowy white eyes staring at me through the window. I still get chills when I think about it. I still look over my shoulder when I'm in the woods. Even now, years later, even here, miles away from Villa Verde, because sometimes in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear them, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that whatever we saw in those woods, it was real. More real than anything I've ever experienced since, and I'll never, ever forget it. Never. And then, a few years ago, I was up late one night flipping channels on TV. Just couldn't sleep, you know. And I stumbled across some show. It was one of those cheesy cable shows, all dramatic music and blurry photos about cryptids, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness monster, that kind of stuff. Usually I'd just roll my eyes and change the channel. But something about this one caught my attention. They were talking about skunk ape. The Florida skunk ape. I'd never heard of it before. They were showing blurry pictures, grainy video footage, people talking about strange sightings in the Everglades. And as I watched, a cold finger of something started to creep up my spine. They were describing something tall, brownish, standing upright, living in the swamps. And then they showed a sketch, an artist's rendition based on witness descriptions. And I almost choked. It was it. The thing I'd seen on Alligator Alley all those years ago. The tall, brown, shapeless figure. The eyes. Suddenly, it all came rushing back. Not as a vague memory from childhood, but as something real, something solid, something terrifying. The heat, the smell, the endless green, the car humming down the highway, and that thing standing there watching me. And this time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was fear, chills, the kind that run deep, right down to your bones. Because now, as an adult, I understood. That wasn't a weird zoo animal. That wasn't some exotic Florida critter. That was something else. Something unknown. Something maybe not even animal. I stayed up the rest of the night, glued to the TV, watching that stupid show, searching online, reading everything I could find about the skunk ape. And the more I read, the more that cold feeling grew. The witness descriptions, the locations, even the feeling people described when they saw it. It all matched. It all fit. It was like they were describing the exact same thing I'd seen. And then I started to remember other details. Little things I'd forgotten over the years. The way the air seemed to go quiet when I saw it. Like all the swamp sounds just stopped. The feeling that it was watching me, not just looking at me. The way it just stood there completely still, not even swaying in the breeze. And the eyes. I can't get the eyes out of my head. They weren't just dark. They were deep, like looking into a bottomless well. And there was something in them. Something old. Something that had seen things, known things, that no human eyes should ever see or know. I don't know what it was. I still don't. And I probably never will. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, heat haze playing games with my kids' eyes. Maybe it was some kind of weird bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was just nothing at all, my imagination running wild in the Florida heat. But I don't think so. I really don't. Something about it felt real, solid, present, and those eyes were not a trick of the light. Ever since then, that memory has been different. It's not just a faded vacation snapshot anymore. It's something else. It's something I think about sometimes when I'm driving late at night on a dark road. Something I think about when I'm in the woods or near water. Something that makes me look twice at shadows, at movement at the edge of my vision. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I wonder, what was it looking at? What did it see in me, in that passing car, in that little kid hanging out the window? And sometimes I wonder, is it still out there? In the swamps, in the green silence, still watching, still waiting? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think I want to know. The not knowing, that's almost worse. And that feeling, that's what stays with you. Story 3. It's still dark, the kind of dark where you can feel it pressing against you, even with your eyes open. You know how it is out in the woods before dawn. The air is biting, crisp, and quiet. Too quiet. That's always the first thing that gets to you, isn't it? That deep woods silence, where every little snap and rustle suddenly sounds 10 times louder than it should, bouncing off the trees and your eardrums until you're practically jumping at shadows. I was up in my stand hours before first light, deer season 2007, private land, a good patch near the forest reserve, a few miles upstream from the serene river. Place I'd hunted for years. Felt like my backyard, honestly. Knew every tree, every dip in the ground. Usually felt comfortable, like I belonged there. That morning, though, different. There was this heavy feeling in the air, you know. Not just the cold, but something else. Like static before a storm. But there were no clouds, no hint of rain, just this pressure. I chalked it up to nerves, anticipation for the hunt, whatever. I told myself I was just being jumpy, checked my rifle again, even though I'd checked it 5 times already. Savage 30-06, trusty thing, always been reliable, made sure the scope was clear, leaned it against the rail of my stand next to my pack. I took a swig of lukewarm coffee from my thermos, the metal cold against my gloves. Steam barely visible in the pitch black. The coffee did nothing to warm me up inside or out. I kept looking towards the east, waiting for that sliver of light to crack the horizon. Any sign of dawn, anything to break this oppressive dark. Then I heard it, not right away. It started as this faint, thumping sound, low frequency, almost below hearing, more like feeling it in your chest. At first I thought it was my own heart, pounding too hard, too fast. Adrenaline maybe, but then it got clearer, more distinct, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. And then I placed it, stones, being moved, in the water. My gut clenched. The creek. There's a small creek runs down the edge of the field, ends in a little waterfall, maybe 10, 12 feet high, drops into the serene river. That was the direction of the sound. Elk. That's what my brain told me. Elk from the reserve. They wander sometimes, especially this time of year. Big animals, they can make a racket crossing a stream, especially in the dark. Okay, elk. That made sense, sort of. But even as I told myself it was elk, a cold finger of doubt was tracing its way up my spine. Elk are noisy, sure, but this was different. It wasn't the sound of splashing water or crashing through brush. It was specifically stones being moved, deliberately. I reached for my binoculars, old Bushnells, good glass though, even in low light. Lifted them, focused towards the sound. Nothing, just blackness. Too dark to see anything down there in the creek bed. I scanned the edge of the field, the tree line. Nothing moving there either. The thumping got closer, louder, less like random stones being kicked and more like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps in the water. And then the branches started to break. Snapping sounds, loud cracks in the still air. Something big, definitely bigger than an elk. Elk don't break branches like that. My heart was hammering now, a frantic drum against my ribs. Adrenaline wasn't just nerves anymore. It was full-blown, cold fear. The kind that makes your mouth go dry and your hands start to sweat, even in freezing air. I brought my rifle up, safety still on. Pointed it generally towards the creek, trying to see through the dark. Binoculars were useless now, too shaky. The breaking branches got closer, closer, right at the base of the waterfall. Whatever it was coming up the creek, towards the waterfall, towards me. And then I saw movement, dark against dark, barely perceptible at first. Something bulky, moving slowly, deliberately, up the bank of the creek towards the base of the waterfall. It was on all fours. Initially. That's what threw me. I was expecting... I don't even know what I was expecting. A bear. Mountain lion. But they don't sound like that. And they certainly don't sound like they're carefully placing their feet on stones underwater. It reached the base of the waterfall. Stopped for a moment, just a hulking dark shape against the even darker shadow of the falls. I could hear water cascading down, a constant rushing sound, mixing with the heavy thumping and snapping noises. Then it started to climb, up the waterfall, on all fours at first, scrambling up the rocks. But then it did something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It stood up, right there, at the base of the waterfall. This massive dark thing just stood up, slowly, deliberately. Like it was nothing. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to stand up on two legs in the middle of a freezing creek in the pitch black before dawn. And it kept rising. Taller and taller. Way taller than any man. Way taller than any bear. Way taller than anything that should be in those woods. I fumbled with the safety on my rifle, thumb numb with cold and fear. Clicked it off. My finger was on the trigger, but my mind was screaming at me, telling me not to move, not to breathe, not to even think. It straightened all the way up, completely upright, like a man. But not a man. Even in the pre-dawn gloom, with just the faint light filtering through the trees and the pale wash of the moon above the canopy, I could make out details through my rifle scope, because that's what I did. Instinct, even terrified, even paralyzed, my hunter's instinct took over. I raised the rifle, sighted in, focused on the shape. And what I saw through that scope, it's burned into my brain. I'll never forget it. Never. It was human-shaped, sort of, but massive, Gigantic, 7, 8 feet tall, maybe more. Hard to judge in the dark, but it dwarfed the waterfall, dwarfed the trees around it, just huge. And its skin, it was dark, rough-looking, like bark almost, or dried mud. I couldn't tell for sure. No fur, though, not like a bear. Smooth skin, or at least smooth-looking skin from this distance. It didn't have a muzzle. That's the thing that really got to me. No snout, no long animal nose. It had a face, sort of. Broad, flat face. No clear features, really, not in that light. But definitely not a snout. And it was sniffing. That's what it was doing. Standing there, at the top of the waterfall now, towering above the creek bed, and it was sniffing. Slow, deep sniffs, drawing the air in through nostrils. Human-like nostrils on that flat, dark face. It was testing the wind, trying to catch a scent, and the way it moved its head. Slow, deliberate sweeps, back and forth, like it was trying to pick up something specific, something in the air. Me? Deer? I didn't know. Didn't want to know. I was frozen. Absolutely, utterly frozen. Rifle up, finger on the trigger. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink, I don't think. Just stared through the scope, heart hammering against my ribs, every nerve in my body screaming. It took a step, a huge step, moved out of the creek bed onto the bank, into the woods, still sniffing, still moving slowly, deliberately. It was heading upstream, away from me, away from my stand, up into the deeper woods, and it just walked away, just like that, turned and walked into the darkness. Cracking branches, stones crunching under its feet, but getting fainter and fainter as it moved further and further away. I watched it go, scope glued to my eye, until it was gone, vanished into the trees, just swallowed by the darkness. And then, silence. Not the woods silence from before. A different kind of silence. Heavy silence. Oppressive silence. Silence that felt knowing, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I lowered the rifle, slowly, safety back on, hands shaking so bad I could barely work the mechanism. Put the rifle down, leaned it against the standrail, sat down on the edge of the seat, hard. Legs felt like jelly, couldn't breathe. Just sat there, staring into the darkness where it had been, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no sense to be made. None. It defied everything I knew, everything I believed. Giants, creatures like that, in Oklahoma, in the woods behind my property. It was impossible. Had to be. But I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes. Felt the fear, the raw, gut-wrenching terror of being in the presence of something unexplainable. Something that shouldn't exist, but did. I stayed in that stand until the sun finally came up, painting the sky in streaks of pale orange and pink. Dawn chorus started up, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves. Life going on like normal, like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. For me, anyway. The woods felt different now. Alien, threatening, no longer familiar, comforting. Now every shadow looked deeper, every sound sounded wrong. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. I jumped, waiting, expecting. I packed up my gear slowly, mechanically. Thermos, pack, rifle, climbed down from the stand, legs still shaky, walked back through the woods to my truck, each step heavy, reluctant. Didn't even bother hunting, didn't want to be there anymore, just wanted to get home. Away from those woods, away from the creek, away from the memory of what I'd seen. Drove home in a daze, kept glancing in the rearview mirror like something was following me, like it might still be out there in the trees watching. Got back to the house, locked the doors, drew the curtains, felt like I needed to barricade myself in. Safe, sort of. Sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring out the window. Sunlight streaming in now, bright and normal. Everything outside looked ordinary, peaceful, but inside my head, chaos, confusion, terror. Tried to tell my wife, Sarah, when she got home from work. Started to, anyway, but the words just wouldn't come out right. Sounded crazy, even to my own ears. Giant. In the woods. Creek. Waterfall. Just rambling nonsense. She looked at me, concerned, a little scared. "Sam, what is it? What happened?" I shook my head. "Nothing," I mumbled. "Just tired. Didn't see anything today." Lied to her face. Because how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone you saw a monster, a creature from nightmare, and expect them to believe you, and not think you finally lost your mind? Kept it to myself, bottled it up, let it fester inside, went back to work the next day, tried to act normal, tried to forget, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, standing there, sniffing the air, that dark, massive shape against the waterfall, and the footsteps, the thumping in the water, haunted my dreams. Still does sometimes. I've gone back to those woods since then, hunted there again, same stand, same creek. Have to. Can't let fear control me, right? But it's never the same. Never feel safe anymore. Always looking over my shoulder. Always listening for sounds in the dark. Always that cold knot of dread in my stomach. Never saw it again. Thank God. But I know it's still out there, somewhere, in those woods, or somewhere else. Maybe closer than I think. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it, faintly, in the distance, that slow, rhythmic thump, 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 stones being moved in the water. And I just know, it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I have no idea what it is or what it wants, and that's the scariest part of all. Not knowing, just knowing that something impossible is real, and it's out there, somewhere in the dark. Story 4. We live, or lived, I guess. I moved out of Harmony Valley a couple of years after all that, on the edge of town. It's not really town, more like a cluster of houses and a gas station that sells more bait than gas. Anyway, our place was proper rural, surrounded by woods and these scrubby, rocky hills. The flint forest, they call it around here, because of the type of rock. Makes it sound all mysterious and cool, but mostly it's just annoying to walk through because you're always twisting your ankles. We were walking back towards the house, me lagging behind, grumbling about my knee, and Caleb was just ahead, probably thinking about video games or whatever teenage guys think about. We were in that little patch between the workshop and the main yard light. It's always darker there, even with the porch light on, because the workshop throws a shadow, and then the trees start right there too, kind of leaning over everything. That's when it happened. This sound, man, it was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. Imagine the loudest, deepest thump you can possibly think of. Like, not just loud, but it vibrated through the ground, through your bones. It sounded like something massive stomping, but not just a normal stomp, like someone banging their foot, more like crushing something, like a giant's foot coming down on a wooden floor and just boom. It came from up the hill, from the woods behind the workshop. Instant silence after it, like everything else just stopped to listen. Crickets shut up. Wind seemed to die down. Nothing. Just this ringing in my ears from the sound itself. We both froze. I mean dead still. Everything went cold, like someone had dropped the temperature 10 degrees in a second. I remember feeling the hairs on my arms stand up, and this ice just spread through my gut. I looked at Caleb, and even in the dim light from the porch, I could see his eyes were wide. He whispered, and his voice was shaky, way shakier than I'd ever heard it. What was that? I didn't have an answer. What could you even say? A car backfiring. No way, this wasn't mechanical, it was organic somehow. Brute force. Before I could even think properly, it happened again. This time louder. Christ, way louder. The first one had been shocking. This one was terrifying. Same sound, that monstrous thump, but closer, heavier. And this time, it wasn't just a single boom. It was a thump-thump. 2 distinct impacts, like whatever it was, had taken another step, closer to us. and it was definitely coming down the hill towards us, not moving away. It felt deliberate, like it was aimed at us. That's when the proper fear hit. Not just being startled, not just jumpy, but bone-deep, gut-wrenching terror. The kind that makes your legs want to turn to jelly and your breath catch in your throat. I was rooted to the spot, my bad knee suddenly feeling like it was made of lead, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Just stared up the hill towards where the sound had come from, into the blackness of the trees. Caleb didn't freeze like me, though. He bolted, like a shot out of a cannon. I swear, I've never seen anyone move that fast in my life. 1 second he was standing there next to me, frozen still. The next he was a blur, just gone. He didn't say a word, didn't look back, just full-on sprinted for the house. And not towards the back door, which was closer, but around the side, towards the front porch light, like he needed to be in the brightest, safest place possible. And then I was alone. Just me and the dark and the silence after Caleb ran. And that silence was worse than the sounds had been. Because now it was like we'd been warned, like those thumps were a warning shot, and now it was waiting, watching. I forced myself to move, to limp forward. Every step was an effort, my knee throbbing now, but not just with pain, with pure adrenaline fear. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the woods, where I thought I'd heard the sound from. Nothing, just trees, dark shapes against a darker sky. No movement, no sound, just nothing. But I could feel it. Something was there, something big, something wrong. You know that feeling you get sometimes, like when you know you're being watched, even when you can't see anyone? It was like that, but amplified 1,000 times. It wasn't just being watched. It was being assessed, hunted. I shuffled forward towards the edge of the yard light. I wanted to shout for Caleb, but my voice felt choked in my throat. And part of me was terrified of making any noise, of drawing attention to myself, to where I was. Because if whatever made that sound was still out there, I didn't want it to know exactly where I was. I finally made it to the edge of the porch light, and Caleb was there, already on the steps, halfway up to the front door. He was turned back towards me, his face pale as death, eyes wide and wild. He was hissing, not even shouting, just this frantic, panicked hissing. "Thomas! Thomas! Get inside! Hurry!" I managed to get to the porch steps and leaned heavily against the railing, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I finally got my voice back, though it was croaky and weak. "What? What was that?" I gasped, looking back towards the woods, still searching the darkness for any sign of anything. Caleb just shook his head, still hissing. I don't know, but it was huge. Did you hear it? Did you feel it? It was like something enormous." "Yeah, I heard it," I said, still trying to process it. Like a footstep? A giant footstep? Footstep?" He looked at me like I was insane. "Footstep? No, man, not just a footstep. Like something landed, like it jumped down from something, and it was so heavy it shook the ground." "Jumped?" I frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Jumped from where? The trees?" That didn't even make sense. The trees weren't that tall, and what kind of animal would make a sound like that? He was pacing back and forth on the porch now, agitated, practically vibrating with fear. "I don't know, Thomas. I don't know what it was, but it was up there." He pointed wildly towards the hill. "In the trees or higher. Something big, something angry. It was like it was trying to scare us. Did you see anything?" I shook my head. "No, nothing, just dark. Did you see anything?" He stopped pacing and looked back at the woods, his face etched with pure terror. "No, but I felt it. I felt like it was watching us. Even before the sound, I felt something, like we weren't alone. That actually made my skin crawl, because I'd felt it too. That prickling feeling on the back of your neck, like eyes on you. But I'd just put it down to being late, being out in the dark, the usual jitters. But what if it wasn't just jitters? We stood there on the porch for what felt like ages, but was probably only a few minutes, just staring into the darkness, listening, waiting. Every little sound made us jump. A rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl way off in the distance. Everything sounded amplified, menacing. But there were no more thumps, no more monstrous footsteps, just silence. But it wasn't a normal silence. It was a heavy silence, a waiting silence, like something was still out there, holding its breath, listening to us breathe. Finally, Caleb couldn't take it anymore. He practically dragged me inside, slamming the front door shut behind us and then fumbling to lock it, bolt it, chain it. Every lock we had, he used. He was breathing like he'd run a marathon. We went into the living room and just stood there, panting, staring at each other. The lights seemed too bright, the silence in the house too thick. It was like we'd brought the fear inside with us, and now it was trapped in here too. What do we do? Caleb whispered finally, his voice still trembling. I don't know, I said honestly. Call Dad? My dad was usually the rational one, the one who knew how to fix things, how to explain things away. But this didn't feel like something that could be explained away. We called my dad. He answered, sounding half asleep. We tried to explain what had happened, the sounds, the feeling, but it sounded ridiculous even as we were saying it. Loud thumps, he said, his voice thick with sleep. Like what? Thunder. No, Dad, not thunder, Caleb broke in, his voice still high-pitched with panic. Like footsteps, giant footsteps, coming from the woods, towards us. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then my dad sighed. Guys, it's late. You're probably just spooked. Maybe it was deer. They can make a lot of noise in the woods. Deer? Dad, this was way louder than deer, I protested. This was like an earthquake. Okay, he said, still sounding unconvinced. Look, why don't you just lock up the house tight, stay inside, and we'll talk about it in the morning, okay? Probably just your imaginations getting the better of you in the dark. But Dad, I started to argue, but he cut me off. Good night, boys. See you in the morning. And he hung up. Just like that. He didn't believe us. He thought we were just kids getting freaked out by the dark. We looked at each other, feeling even more alone and vulnerable than before. If even our own dad didn't believe us, who would? And what if it wasn't just our imaginations? What if there really was something out there? We spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, all the lights on, jumping at every creak of the house, every rustle outside the windows. We barely spoke, just sat there, listening, waiting, terrified. We didn't sleep a wink. When morning finally came, pale and grey through the windows, it felt like a huge relief. The fear didn't vanish, but it dulled, edged with the faint light of day. We went outside, cautiously, checking around the house, the yard, the edge of the woods. Nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Just the same quiet, peaceful Harmony Valley morning as always. Birds chirping, sun rising, dew on the grass. It was like the night before had been a dream, a nightmare that had faded with the dawn. We walked up to the workshop, and everything was fine there too. Locked up, untouched, normal. It was almost anticlimactic. My dad came home later that morning. He looked at us, saw our tired, drawn faces, and maybe he finally realized we weren't just messing around. He didn't laugh or dismiss it like he had on the phone. He just looked concerned. So, he said, tell me again what you heard. We told him the whole story again, from start to finish, trying to describe the sounds, the feeling, the fear. He listened, this time, really listened, without interrupting. When we were done, he just stood there for a minute, thinking. Well, he said finally, I don't know what to tell you boys. Maybe it was deer. Maybe it was I don't know. Cougars are rare around here, but they've been spotted in Oklahoma. Maybe it was a cougar jumping down from a tree. They're big, they can make a lot of noise. A cougar, maybe. It was the only explanation he could come up with, the only one that sounded even remotely plausible. But deep down, neither me nor Caleb really believed it. Cougars don't sound like that, and they don't make you feel like you're being hunted, like you're prey. We never heard the sounds again after that night. Nothing happened. Life went back to normal in Harmony Valley. But for me and Caleb, things were different. We couldn't shake the feeling of what we'd heard, what we'd felt. We started locking up earlier, rushing back to the house in the evenings, always looking over our shoulders. The woods around our house didn't seem so peaceful anymore, so ordinary. They felt different now. They felt like they were hiding something big and unknown and angry. And sometimes late at night when everything's quiet and dark, I still hear it. Not the sound itself, not really, but the echo of it in my memory. That deep, monstrous thump that shook the ground and froze our blood. And I wonder, what was it? What was out there in the hills behind our house that night? And was it still out there? Watching, waiting? I don't know. And that's the thing that scares me the most. The not knowing. The feeling that there are things out there in the dark, things we can't explain, things we don't understand, and things that are definitely not friendly. And sometimes, I swear, when the wind is just right, I can almost feel that weight again. That pressure, like something immense is stepping just outside the edge of the light, in the shadows, just listening, just waiting. Story 5. Honestly, the whole thing felt like a bust from the get-go. We'd driven all that way. Some of us flew in from even further, hyped up about this project, this cryptid hominid genome project. Sounded serious, right? Turns out serious meant a lot of talking and not a whole lot of actual doing. Days were spent in some drafty barn going over maps, showing each other blurry photos, arguing about what droppings looked like. Droppings! We were supposed to be on the cutting edge of science, and we were arguing about poop. Me and Billy Bob, old Billy Bob they called him, even though he wasn't that old, just looked like he'd wrestled a bear and lost. We were getting stir-crazy. Billy Bob's a character, always itching for action. He's been tracking cryptids, mostly Bigfoot for, I don't even know how long. Decades, probably. Me, I'm newer to this, still pretty wide-eyed. I was excited, truly excited, to maybe find something real, solid proof, not just blurry photos and plaster casts of footprints. I was there for the DNA, for the actual science part, but this meetup, it was like everyone was scared to actually go look for anything. Too much talk, not enough walk. By the third night, I was about ready to pack it in and drive back home, sitting around listening to Professor Whoever drone on about possible migratory patterns while we were miles from civilization and probably miles from any Bigfoot, just felt pointless. That night was cold, really cold. October in northern New Mexico gets that sharp, biting cold that goes right through you. The moon was almost full, though, bright enough to cast long, spooky shadows everywhere. We were supposed to be keeping a low profile, but Billy Bob had this look in his eye. That we're doing something tonight look. Screw this, he muttered under his breath after another hour of pointless discussion. We're gonna find something ourselves. I was hesitant. We'd been told to stick to groups, stay near camp, all the usual safety stuff. But the boredom was eating at me, and Billy Bob, he just had this way of making you feel like you were missing out if you stayed behind. Plus, the idea of actually doing something, finally, was too tempting. So, we snuck out. Simple as that. Just slipped away from the campfire while everyone was busy arguing about thermal imaging cameras and their effectiveness in thick brush. Nobody even noticed we were gone. We walked towards the river. The San Juan. It wasn't far from the camp, maybe a 10-minute walk. The ranch was bordered by it, I think. Moonlight glinted off the water, making it look almost silver. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the rustle of leaves. That kind of quiet that's almost louder than noise, you know? That pregnant silence where you feel like something else, something big, is out there listening too. We got to this irrigation ditch first, just a muddy channel, mostly dry this late in the year. Then, a bit further on, we saw the cattle tunnel, one of those concrete tubes they put under roads or fields for cows to walk through. This one looked old, kind of beat up, like it had been there forever. Overgrown weeds poking around the edges. The entrance was just this gaping black hole in the earth, disappearing into absolute darkness. Billy Bob, naturally, was all about checking it out. "Betcha anything a Squatch would use something like this for cover," he said, grinning, flashlight already in his hand. Squatch. He always called it Squatch. He didn't even wait for me. He just ducked down and went right into that tunnel. I hesitated. That tunnel. It felt wrong. Just looking at it made my skin crawl. It was too dark, too enclosed, like something could be waiting in there, something you wouldn't want to meet. "You comin' or what, Junior?" Billy Bob's voice echoed back from inside the tunnel, muffled and distorted. "Junior. That's what everyone called me. Jesus Junior. My real name is Jesus, but my dad was also Jesus, so Junior it is. Not exactly the most intimidating name when you're potentially facing down Bigfoot, is it?" I took a deep breath and followed him, but I didn't go into the tunnel. No way. I told Billy Bob I'd keep watch up top. By this, well, it wasn't really a bridge, just a couple of thick planks laid across the ditch, right next to the tunnel entrance. It was enough to cross, though. So Billy Bob disappeared into the blackness of the tunnel, his flashlight beam bobbing around down there, and I stayed up top, perched on these rickety planks, looking around. The silence was even heavier now. The crickets seemed to have gone quiet. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass around the ditch, and the thump, thump, thump of my own heart in my ears. Honestly, I was scared. Not like screaming and running scared, but that low-level, constant hum of unease that settles deep in your gut and just sits there, being out there in the dark, miles from anyone, in Bigfoot country. It gets to you. And then I heard it, a sound from the tall grass on the other side of the ditch by the edge of the water. Just a rustle at first, like something moving through the dry grass. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, the wind. But then it happened again, louder this time, and different. It wasn't just rustling anymore, it was heavier, more deliberate, like something big moving around in there. My mind started racing. Bigfoot, could it actually be? My heart was hammering now, hard and fast. I wanted to run back to camp, to safety, to the campfire and the boring professors and the blurry photos. But something else kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity. Stupid, reckless curiosity. And then I did something even stupider. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was bravado, maybe it was just plain dumb. I took out my lighter, a cheap plastic thing, and a small flat stone I'd picked up. And I started tapping the lighter rhythmically against the stone. Tap, 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 just like that. Like trying to imitate some kind of drumming. Idiotic, I know. I was trying to provoke it, whatever was out there in the grass, trying to get a reaction, trying to communicate. I don't know what I was thinking. Looking back, it's insane. I tapped a few times, waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind, the rustling grass. And then it happened. Tap, clear as day, from the grass. A tap, a single distinct tap, answering mine. My blood went cold, like ice water flooding through my veins. It wasn't my imagination. I hadn't hallucinated it. I'd heard it. A tap coming from the dark grass, responding to my tapping. I froze, lighter still in my hand, stone pressed against it, staring into the grass, trying to see through the shadows, through the moonlight and the rustling leaves, trying to make out anything. Tap, tap. I tapped again. 2 taps this time. Tap, tap. The answer came back instantly. 2 taps from the grass. Same rhythm, same spacing. It was mimicking me. Oh God. Oh God, oh God. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was some kind of nightmare. but it felt real. Terribly, horribly real. The cold air on my skin, the rough wood of the planks under my boots, the metallic tang of fear in my mouth, all real. And the taps, those were real too. We kept tapping back and forth for maybe a minute. Me and whatever was in the grass. A bizarre, terrifying conversation in taps. Tap, 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 tap. Short bursts, single taps responding to each other, echoing through the cold night air. It was like we were speaking a language of taps, and whatever was out there, it understood. It was communicating. Then I heard Billy Bob's voice from the tunnel. "Anything up there, Junior? This tunnel's empty, nothing but spiderwebs and bat droppings." His flashlight beam swung wildly as he emerged from the tunnel entrance, scrambling back up onto the bank of the ditch. The tapping stopped, just stopped. Abruptly. The answering taps from the grass ceased as soon as Billy Bob started talking, like it had been startled, or didn't want to be heard. Billy Bob reached me, breathing heavily, flashlight beam sweeping across the grass. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. What's with the tapping?" I could barely speak. My throat felt tight, like it was closing up. I heard something," I stammered, pointing to the grass. "In there, something tapping back." Billy Bob scoffed. "Tapping? What do you mean, tapping?" He walked closer to the edge of the ditch, peering into the tall grass. "Raccoons, maybe? Possums?" "No," I insisted, my voice shaking. "It wasn't animal sounds. It was taps, like someone tapping back to me. We were communicating." Even as I said the words, they sounded insane. Communication with what? Billy Bob still looked skeptical, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe just that ingrained need to investigate anything remotely weird. He was Billy Bob, after all. And then he did the most Billy Bob thing ever. Without saying a word, without thinking, he just plunged into the tall grass. Right where the tapping had come from, just waded into the darkness, flashlight beam cutting through the stalks. "Billy Bob, what are you doing?" I yelled, adrenaline jolting through me again, sharp and cold. This was insane. We were supposed to be quiet, cautious, and now he was just barging into the unknown in the dark, in Bigfoot country. He didn't answer me. He just kept going, pushing deeper into the grass, the beam of his flashlight disappearing and reappearing between the stalks. I stood frozen on the planks, watching him, my heart pounding like a drum solo. Then I heard it again. From further out in the grass, away from Billy Bob now, a sudden crashing sound, like something big running, breaking branches, snapping twigs, rustling the grass violently as it moved. It was moving fast, moving away. Billy Bob stopped dead in the grass, his flashlight beam fixed on the spot where the crashing sound had come from. He stood there for a moment, listening, then slowly started pushing his way back towards me, thrashing through the grass like a bear himself. When he emerged back onto the bank, he was grinning. That wild, excited grin that always meant he thought he'd found something big. "Hot damn, Junior!" he exclaimed out of breath. "You were right. Something was in there. Something big." "What was it? Did you see it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Didn't see nothing clear," he said, still grinning. But the spot where it was sitting, Junior, it's still warm to the touch, like something big and heavy was just laying there." Warm grass in the middle of an October night? That made no sense. Unless it was a living creature, a creature with a body temperature warmer than the night air. My fear ratcheted up another notch. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was something else, something dangerous. "Billy Bob," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here, now. This isn't good." He was still hyped up, though. Nah, hold on a minute," he said, peering back into the darkness. "Let's just take another look. Maybe it'll come back." "No! Billy Bob, come on! We're out of our minds," I pleaded, tugging at his arm. He finally seemed to notice the look on my face, the real fear in my eyes. His grin faded slightly. All right, he conceded reluctantly. Maybe you're right. Too risky out here in the open. Let's head back to camp, tell the others. We started walking back quickly, not running exactly, but definitely hustling. The adrenaline was pumping, fear and excitement mixing in my gut in a queasy, unsettling way. I kept looking back over my shoulder into the darkness, expecting to see, I don't know what. Red eyes glowing in the trees, a massive shadowy figure lumbering after us. We were almost back to the tree line bordering the ranch grounds when it happened. Just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow moving between the trees at the edge of the field. Big, dark, gone in a blink. I stopped dead in my tracks, grabbing Billy Bob's arm, pointing. Did you see that? He stopped too, squinting into the trees. See what? Just shadows, Junior. Moonlight playing tricks. No, I saw something big, in the trees. It moved. I was practically yelling now, my voice cracking with fear. Billy Bob finally seemed to take me seriously. He scanned the tree line, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. All right, calm down, he said, his voice lower now, more serious. Let's just get back to camp. Quickly. We practically ran the rest of the way back to camp, bursting out of the darkness and into the relative safety of the campfire circle. People looked up, surprised to see us. Professor Whoever frowned, looking annoyed. Where have you two been? He demanded, his voice tight. We were about to send out a search party. We heard something, Billy Bob started, still breathing heavily. Out by the river. Something big. Maybe a squatch. Professor Whoever just rolled his eyes. Oh, please, not this again. There are coyotes, deer, any number of animals out there. It was probably just wildlife. I tried to explain about the tapping, about the warm spot, about the shadowy figure in the trees. But nobody really listened. They dismissed it all as our imaginations, as rookie mistakes, as too much excitement and not enough sleep. Professor Whoever just huffed and told us to stay close to camp for the rest of the night. We sat by the fire, huddled together, shivering despite the heat, our eyes still wide, glancing nervously into the darkness surrounding the camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever we'd encountered out by the river was still out there, somewhere in the shadows. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to their tents, Billy Bob and I were still sitting by the dying embers of the fire, talking in hushed whispers. We couldn't sleep. The fear was still too raw, too real. The image of that dark shadow in the trees, it was burned into my brain. Suddenly a sharp crack split the silence, like a gunshot, or like a rock hitting something hard. We both jumped, startled, looking around wildly. Then Billy Bob yelped, loudly, and clutched his arm. Ow, God damn it, what the hell? We fumbled for our flashlights, shining them around, and there it was, lying on the ground near Billy Bob's feet. A rock, not just any rock, a rock the size of a billiard ball, smooth, round, heavy, and it had clearly just been thrown, hard. It hit me, Billy Bob exclaimed, rubbing his arm. Damn thing hit me right in the arm, came out of nowhere. We scanned the darkness with our flashlights, frantically, desperately trying to see who or what had thrown the rock. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, darkness. The silence of the night pressing in around us again. Nobody else had heard the rock hit, or at least nobody came out of their tents to investigate. Either they were all asleep, or they were choosing to ignore it. Professor Whoever probably just thought we were playing pranks again. But we knew it wasn't a prank. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, a clear, deliberate warning. Stay away. Leave us alone. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat by the cold ashes of the campfire, wrapped in blankets, shivering, listening to every rustle, every snap of a twig in the darkness, waiting for... We didn't even know what we were waiting for. Another rock? Something worse? The next morning, everyone was packing up, getting ready to leave. The cryptozoology meetup was over. Another bust. No Bigfoot DNA, no solid proof. Just a lot of blurry photos and arguments about poop. As I was loading my gear into my car, getting ready to drive away, it happened again. Another crack, sharper, louder than the first. Something hit my car, hard, right on the hood, just above the windshield. I jumped, spinning around, heart leaping into my throat again. And there, on the hood of my car, was another rock. Smaller this time, maybe half the size of the first one. But still, a rock. And it had clearly been thrown, from somewhere unseen. I looked up, into the trees surrounding the campsite, searching for any sign, any movement. But there was nothing. Just leaves rustling in the morning breeze, birds chirping, the normal sounds of the forest. Everyone else was too busy packing to notice. Or maybe they did notice, but just pretended not to. Billy Bob saw me, though. He saw the rock on my car, saw the look on my face. He just nodded slowly, grimly. He knew exactly what it meant. A goodbye present. Or maybe a warning. A final chilling reminder. Don't come back, we're here, and we're watching. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away. Looking in my rearview mirror, at the ranch, at the trees, at the vast, empty landscape of northern New Mexico. I haven't been back since, and honestly, I don't ever want to go back. Not ever. Some things are better left unknown, and some places you just shouldn't disturb. There are things out there in the dark, in the wild places that we don't understand, and maybe we're not meant to. Story 6. Okay, so, I'm not usually one to post stuff like this online, honestly never have, but this thing that happened a while back still messes with me sometimes, and I guess getting it out there might help. Or maybe just knowing if anyone else has ever seen or heard anything similar would be something. I don't know. Just bear with me, all right? It was March, beginning of March, and I was visiting my buddy Jake in Willow Creek, Florida. Willow Creek is like small town Florida. Quiet. We're talking really quiet. Not much happens there, which is kind of why I liked visiting him. I live up north where it's always busy and loud, so Willow Creek was a nice break. Jake lives in one of those neighborhoods that's kind of on the edge of town, where the houses start to thin out and you get woods behind them. Really thick woods. And swamps. Florida swamps. You know, the works. Anyway, it was a Friday night, a really clear, cool night for Florida. No humidity. Stars were out. Everything felt just calm. We'd just finished eating pizza at Jake's place. Just your average Friday night hanging out, playing some video games, the usual. Around maybe 10 o'clock, Jake suggested we take a walk. He's always been the outdoorsy type, even though we were basically surrounded by swamp. There's this boardwalk not too far from his house. It cuts through this wooded area that backs up to the bigger swamp. He said it was cool to walk at night sometimes, hear the night sounds and all that. I was game. Seemed like a decent way to walk off all that pizza. We set off from his house, walked down a couple of streets, and then we were at the entrance to the boardwalk. It's not fancy or anything, just old wood planks nailed together, raised a couple of feet off the ground on posts. It kind of zigzags its way through this patch of woods, probably meant for bird watchers or something during the day. At night, though, it's completely different. Dark. Really dark. The trees are thick overhead, blocking out most of the streetlights from the neighborhood, and once you get further in, there's no light at all except for the stars if you look up through the gaps in the trees. We started walking, Jake leading the way because he knew the path better. It was quiet, except for our shoes hitting the wood and the usual crickets and night insects buzzing around. We were just talking about some stupid movie we'd watched, nothing serious. I was maybe, I don't know, like 20 feet behind Jake. I tend to wander when I walk, kind of zone out and look around. That's probably why I noticed it first, I guess. We were maybe a quarter mile in, deeper into the woods. The trees were getting thicker, and the swamp was getting closer on our left. You could smell that swampy, earthy smell, a little musty, you know? It was quiet, almost too quiet, like even the bugs had shut up for a second. And then I heard it. It wasn't loud at first, just odd. It was coming from my left, from the direction of the swamp, a kind of heavy thump, like something big hitting the water. Thump, thump. It was rhythmic, but uneven. I stopped walking and listened. "Jake, did you hear that?" I asked, not yelling, but loud enough for him to hear me since he was a bit ahead. He stopped too and turned around. "Hear what?" "Just frogs, probably," he said, kind of dismissively, but he was listening too. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking into the darkness of the swamp on our left, but it wasn't frogs. It was way too heavy for frogs, and too regular, but also irregular at the same time, like something big was stepping in the water, but not walking normal, more like stomping. Thump, 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 thump. It started to get faster. "No, man, listen," I said, stepping closer to Jake. "That's not frogs. That sounds big." We both just stood there, frozen, listening. The thumps were getting closer to the boardwalk, still coming from the swamp on our left, and they were getting louder. Each thump sounded like someone was dropping a massive boulder into the water, but rhythmic, like footsteps, gigantic footsteps in water, and they were getting faster. Thump, 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 thump. Whatever it was moving fast, really fast. Through the water, whatever was in there, swamp water, mud, muck, whatever, it wasn't slowing it down. That's when Jake freaked out. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice shaky. He was staring into the darkness between the trees on the swamp side of the boardwalk. "Over there, something white." I hadn't seen anything white. I was too focused on the sound, trying to figure out what the hell was making those noises. But now, with Jake saying he saw something, I strained my eyes to see into the dark woods. It was hard, really hard. The trees were so dense, and it was so dark between them. But then, just for a split second, between two tree trunks, I saw movement. It wasn't white, it was dark, really dark, like a shadow but moving, and tall, really tall, taller than the trees nearby. It was hard to tell exactly in that split second and in that darkness, but it was like a dark, towering shape moving among the trees, and it was moving in the same direction as the sounds, towards us, or not exactly towards us on the boardwalk, but parallel to it, in the swamp and woods next to it. And it was on two legs. I saw that much, whatever it was. It was moving upright on two legs, and it was huge. Just that glimpse, that split second of dark, moving shape, and that sound, the heavy, rhythmic thumps getting closer and faster, it all clicked together in my brain. And it clicked into one word: danger. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't a logical thought, not like, "That sounds like an alligator, we should be careful." It was pure instinct, raw fear, the kind of fear that just grabs you by the throat and tells you to run. Now. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I turned and bolted, ran as fast as I could back the way we came, pounding my feet on the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Behind me, I heard Jake yelling something, I think my name, and then I heard him running too, his footsteps right behind mine. We were running blindly, heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline flooding my system. The thumping sounds were still there, still coming from the swamp, keeping pace with us, maybe even gaining on us. Thump, 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 thump. Faster and faster, louder and louder. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, focusing on the boardwalk in front of me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at my face. I almost tripped a couple of times, but I kept going. I could hear Jake right behind me, his breathing heavy and panicked. We ran and ran. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a couple of minutes. But in those minutes, everything felt distorted and stretched out, like time itself was slowing down and speeding up at the same time. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing, Jake's footsteps right behind me, and the relentless thump, thump, thump from the swamp. Finally, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light through the trees ahead. Streetlights. We were almost out of the woods. Hope surged through me, mixed with the burning pain in my lungs and the screaming muscles in my legs. We pushed ourselves even harder. We burst out of the woods and back onto the street, stumbling onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we were back in Jake's front yard, collapsed onto his lawn, chests heaving. It was quiet on the street, just normal suburban night sounds, distant cars, a dog barking a couple of blocks away. Nothing like the terrifying sounds we just heard in the woods, but even out here, in the light, surrounded by houses, I could still hear it in my head. The thump, thump, thump. We lay there on the grass for what felt like a long time, just breathing, trying to get our heart rates to slow down. Neither of us said anything for a while. We were both too shaken, too winded, and I think too scared to talk. Finally, Jake sat up. He was pale, sweating, and his eyes were wide. What the hell was that?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. I sat up too, feeling shaky and cold despite the night air. I don't know," I said, my voice just as shaky. "But did you see it? That dark thing?" Jake nodded, still staring out towards the woods like he expected something to come crashing out of the trees at any moment. "I saw something white," he said. "Flicker of white, big, tall." "I saw something dark," I said. "Tall and dark, moving through the trees. And the sounds, those sounds like boulders in the water." We just looked at each other, both of us pale and freaked out. Neither of us could make sense of it. We'd lived near woods and swamps our whole lives. We knew the sounds of the night, the animals, everything. This was nothing we'd ever heard before, nothing we could explain. We stayed out on Jake's lawn for a while longer, catching our breath, trying to calm down. We talked about it, trying to rationalize it, to make it something normal. Maybe a deer thrashing in the water. But deer aren't that big, and they don't make that kind of sound, and they sure as hell don't move that fast on two legs. Maybe a bear. But bears aren't common around Willow Creek, and again, the sounds, the speed, and the way it moved, it didn't fit. And what about the white thing Jake saw? And the dark thing I saw? We went inside eventually, still jumpy and on edge. We turned on all the lights in the house, locked all the doors, and even checked the windows twice. We stayed up late that night, talking in hushed voices, trying to figure out what we'd experienced. But we couldn't come up with anything that made sense. The next day, we were still shaken. We tried to pretend it hadn't happened, to just brush it off as our imaginations running wild. But we both knew what we'd heard and what we'd seen, or thought we'd seen. We couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the lingering fear that something was out there, in those woods, something we couldn't understand. We didn't go near the boardwalk again for the rest of my visit. And honestly, I haven't been back since. Every time I think about Willow Creek, I think about that night, that walk, and those sounds. The thump, thump, thump in the dark swamp, and that fleeting glimpse of something tall and dark moving between the trees. Or the white shape Jake saw. To this day, I have no idea what it was. We never told anyone about it, figured they'd think we were crazy. But I know what we experienced. We both do. We were both terrified. And whatever was out there, in the dark woods by that boardwalk in Willow Creek, Florida, it wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. And I'm still not sure I ever want to know what it really was. Sometimes not knowing is almost worse. You're left with this feeling, this unsettling, chilling feeling that something is out there, something unseen, unknown, and potentially dangerous, lurking just on the edge of what we think is normal. And that's a feeling that sticks with you, trust me. Story 7. It was January in Maine, the kind of January that bites right through your clothes and chills you to the bone in seconds. Frostbite Falls, they call it, and they aren't kidding. We just wrapped up a job over in Millinocket, me and Andy, heading back west towards my place. Andy's from Tennessee, so this kind of cold is like something out of a movie for him, even after a few years of working together. He keeps saying he'll get used to it, but I see him layering up like an onion every winter, so I'm not buying it. The snow was coming down pretty thick, not a blizzard, more like one of those slow, steady falls that just piles up and up until everything is muffled and the world turns white. Visibility wasn't great, but the roads were mostly clear enough. We were just talking about, I don't even remember now, some dumb work thing probably. Andy was driving, thank God, because my mind was already drifting towards home, a hot shower, maybe a beer. We were on Route 11, you know, that stretch outside of town where the woods get really dense on both sides. Not farms, not houses, just miles of trees. I was looking out the window, watching the snow pile up on the branches, the way it weighs them down. It's actually kind of beautiful, even in the dead of winter, that stark, silent beauty that Maine has. Then I saw it. Just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees on the right side of the road. I wasn't really paying attention at first, just sort of noticed something was different. My brain clicked over to deer automatically, you know, the way it does when you live around here. But then it moved again, and it was bigger, way bigger than a deer. "Hey, Andy, slow down a sec," I said, pointing out the windshield. "Think that's a moose." Andy loves seeing wildlife. Being from Tennessee, even a squirrel gets him excited sometimes. He started slowing the truck, craning his neck to look. We both peered into the trees, trying to make out what it was in the snow and the shadows. "Where? I don't see," he started. And then it stepped out. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen or even imagined seeing in my life. It came out of the trees on 2 legs. That's the first thing that just slammed into my brain. 2 legs. Not like a bear standing up for a second, but walking, striding out from the woods like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was tall, I mean seriously tall, taller than any man, taller than any bear I've ever seen, maybe 7, 8 feet. Hard to say for sure. It all happened so fast and my mind was kind of short-circuiting right there. And it was covered in fur, maybe, or thick hair. It was reddish-brown, kind of matted-looking, and it was heavy, bulky. Not sleek like a deer or a wolf, but solid, like it was made of muscle and bone and something else. Something dense. Andy let out a gasp, like someone had punched him in the gut. I know I probably made some kind of noise too, but I don't remember what. My whole body just went ice-cold. It wasn't walking exactly towards the road at first. It was moving parallel to it, just coming out of the trees and into that narrow strip of snow-covered verge between the woods and the asphalt. But then it turned its head, or whatever you'd call it, and looked right at us. And that's when it started coming straight for the road. Not running, not even really fast, but purposeful, like it knew exactly where we were and what it was doing. It moved on those 2 legs, and it wasn't clumsy or awkward. It was fluid, almost like a man walking, but something utterly wrong about it at the same time. Andy slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched on the snow-covered road, and the truck slid a little before stopping, maybe 20 feet away from where this thing was now standing on the edge of the road. It was closer now, much closer. The details started hitting me, details that I didn't want to see, didn't want to register. Its head, it wasn't animal, not really. It was rounded, almost human-shaped, but wider, heavier, and the face, God, the face. It didn't have a snout like a dog or a muzzle like a bear. It was flat, almost. And the eyes, they were set forward like human eyes, and they were looking right at us. They weren't animal eyes either, they were intelligent. That's the only word I can think of, not just aware, like an animal is aware of its surroundings, but intelligent, like it was actually looking at us, seeing us, thinking something. And there was something else in those eyes, something hard, cold, something that made my blood run like ice water. Andy was making these choked, whimpering sounds beside me. I could see his hands clamped white-knuckle tight on the steering wheel. He was staring, frozen, mouth open. I couldn't blame him. I was just as terrified, but somewhere in the back of my mind, something was pushing me to look, to see, to understand what I was seeing, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to look away, to run. The creature started to move again. It stepped onto the road. It was closer. Maybe 10 feet from the hood of the truck now. It wasn't making any noise, not a growl, not a snort, nothing. Just those heavy, silent steps on the snow. It lowered itself down a little, bending its legs. It was like it was crouching, but still on 2 legs. It got lower, closer to the hood, and leaned forward. And then it was looking right into the windshield. It was looking directly at us, both of us. Its face was right there, maybe 2-3 feet from my face. I could see the details now, so close it felt like I was being forced to see them. The fur wasn't fur exactly. It was coarse, thick hair, like wiry reddish-brown human hair, but much thicker, much denser, covering its whole body except its face. Its face was different. The skin was thick, leathery, a sort of dull reddish-brown color too. It was wrinkled around the eyes, around the mouth, and the eyes themselves. They were dark, deep-set, and surrounded by folds of that leathery skin. And the smell, Jesus, the smell. It was rank, musky, like wet animal fur mixed with something rotten, something sour. It hit me in the face, even through the vents of the truck. It was heavy, suffocating. I could see its nostrils flare just slightly. It was breathing, I realized. This thing was breathing, living. Time stopped. I know people say that, but it's the only way to describe it. Everything just slowed down, stretched out, became thick and viscous like honey. I was just staring into those eyes, and they were staring back. There was no emotion in them that I could read, not exactly anger, not exactly curiosity, just assessment, like it was studying us, taking us apart with its gaze, figuring out what we were. I tried to breathe, but my chest was tight, like someone was sitting on it. I could feel the sweat beading up on my forehead, even in that freezing cold truck. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, anything to break that moment, to break that gaze. But I couldn't move. I was locked solid, just staring. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. It just straightened up, turned, and took off. It was impossibly fast. 1 second it was right there in front of the truck. The next it was moving, leaping, bounding across the road. 3, maybe 4 strides, huge, powerful strides, and it was across the road and disappearing back into the woods on the other side. It was like it vanished. One moment it was there, massive, terrifying, real as anything I'd ever seen, and then it was just gone, swallowed up by the trees and the snow, just like that. We sat there, me and Andy, frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, the spot where the trees closed in on the road. The only sound was the ticking of the engine and Andy's ragged breathing. I don't know how long we sat there, maybe minutes, maybe longer. It felt like hours. Finally, Andy made a noise, a kind of shuddering gasp. What was that, Matt?" His voice was thin, shaky, barely a whisper. I couldn't answer him, because I had no idea, no earthly idea what we had just seen. I don't know," I managed to croak out, my own voice sounding strange and distant in my ears. I have no idea." He kept staring out the windshield, still frozen. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. It was trembling, vibrating like a live wire. "Andy," I said, a little louder this time, we gotta go." He didn't move for a second more. Then slowly, like he was coming out of a trance, he nodded. He put the truck in gear and pulled slowly, carefully, back onto the road. We drove in silence. A heavy, thick silence that filled the cab like that awful smell had. We didn't talk about it for a long time. Not really. Later that night, back at my place, after we'd both had a couple of whiskeys, Andy said, You think it was a bear? Standing up?" And I just shook my head. No, Andy, it wasn't a bear. I know bears. I've seen bears, hunted bears. That wasn't a bear. Then, what? What else could it be? I didn't have an answer for him then, and I still don't now. I've tried to explain it away 1,000 times in my head. Maybe it was the snow playing tricks on our eyes, some weird optical illusion. Maybe we were both tired imagining things. Maybe, but no. I know what I saw. We both saw it. That thing. On 2 legs, those eyes, that face, the smell, and the way it moved. So powerful, so deliberate. It changed something in me that day. I've lived in these woods my whole life. I've hunted, hiked, camped, explored. I always felt like I knew this land, knew its creatures, understood the rules. But that thing showed me that I didn't know anything, that there were things out there, in the woods, in the shadows, that we can't even imagine, things that defy explanation, things that scare you to your core. I still go into the woods. I still hunt. It's in my blood. It's what I do. But it's different now. Every time I'm out there, especially alone, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something is out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, something big and powerful and unknowable. And I can't help but wonder if it's watching me, the way it watched us that day on the road. If it remembers us, if it's waiting for us to come back. I haven't told many people about this. Most folks would think I was crazy or lying. Andy and I, we don't talk about it much either. It's like we both just want to forget it ever happened. But I can't. I can still see its face in my mind, clear as day. Those dark, intelligent eyes. That something. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling outside and the house is quiet, I think I hear things out in the woods. Just noises, maybe branches breaking, or the wind through the trees. But sometimes it sounds like something bigger, something heavier, moving out there in the dark, something walking on 2 legs. And I know it's probably just my imagination, the memory playing tricks on me. But still, I find myself checking the locks on the doors a little more carefully, listening a little harder, and hoping to God that I never see anything like that again. Because whatever it was we saw out there in Frostbite Falls that day, it wasn't from this world. Or maybe it was. And that's the scariest thought of all, that things like that are real, that they exist, hidden in plain sight, just beyond the edge of our understanding. And we have no idea what else is out there. Story 8. Okay, so I've been thinking about whether to even write this down, put it out there, you know? It's not something you just chat about at the gas station or during coffee with the guys. But then I figured, what's the harm? Maybe someone else out there has heard something similar, or maybe I'm just plain crazy after all these years of thinking I knew the woods like the back of my hand. This happened back in January of 2016, Warren Woods, just outside of Hemlock, Maine. Bitter cold it was, the kind of cold that bites right through your layers, even if you think you're bundled up good. Snow everywhere, crisp and crunchy underfoot. Beautiful, you know, until it wasn't. I've been hunting those woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. My granddad took me, then my dad, and then I took my nephew, Jake. Jake's a good kid, always been eager to learn, but maybe a little too eager to get out into the woods too fast. That night, it was him and me, out for coyotes. We figured January, they'd be hungry and on the move. We set up just off Hemlock Road, maybe a mile or 2 deep into Warren Woods. It's thick woods there, mostly pines and hemlocks, as you'd expect, but gets pretty dense as you go in, and the terrain's rolling, little hills and dips all over the place. Perfect for setting up an ambush for coyotes, or so we thought. We had one of those electronic coyote callers. You know the kind. Little speaker thing, plays all sorts of animal sounds. We set it up maybe 50 yards out in a little clearing, facing uphill towards the denser part of the woods. Figured the sound would carry and pull them down to us. We were positioned back under some thick pines, good cover, good view of the clearing. We killed the lights, settled in, and flipped on the caller. Just a basic coyote howl loop. Nothing fancy. It was quiet for a while. Real quiet. The kind of quiet you only get in the woods in the dead of winter, especially at night. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even crickets. Just the faint hum of the caller and the steady, cold stillness. We'd been sitting maybe 20, 30 minutes, not saying much, just listening. Jake was fidgeting a little, but I gave him a look and he settled down. Patience is key, especially in coyote hunting. Then the caller finished its cycle. Silence again. Complete silence. We were waiting to see if we'd hear any rustling, any telltale sounds of a coyote approaching, but nothing. Not a damn thing. After a minute or two, I figured, maybe we should try a different sound or move locations. Just as I was about to reach for the caller remote, it happened. It started low, a deep rumble, almost like distant thunder, but too organic. You feel it more than hear it at first, a vibration in the ground, in your chest. Then it grew, morphed into a howl, but nothing like any coyote I'd ever heard, and I've heard plenty. This wasn't a high-pitched, yipping howl. This was massive, deep, resonant, like it was coming from something huge, something with lungs the size of barrels. It started as a howl, but quickly deepened into something more guttural, more primal. It was coming from uphill, from the direction the caller was facing, but way, way deeper into the woods. Not 50 yards, not 100. Further. And it wasn't just loud, it was powerful. The air vibrated with it. You could feel it rattling in your bones. It echoed across the little valley we were in, bouncing off the opposite slope. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force. Like something ancient and angry had just woken up and was screaming its rage into the night. I froze. Jake beside me, I could feel him tensing up, going rigid. He whispered, "Uncle Matt, what the hell was that?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to process it, to make sense of it. Coyote? No. Dog? Not a chance. Bear? Maybe. But bears don't howl like that. And bears in January are usually hibernating unless something really screwed with them. This didn't sound injured, it sounded furious. Then the howl morphed again. It started to get deeper, rougher, changing from a howl to a roar. A deep, chest-rattling roar that just kept building in intensity. It got louder and louder until it felt like it was vibrating inside your head, like it was going to crack your eardrums. The sound was so intense, it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the snow crunching under my own boots, couldn't hear Jake breathing heavily beside me. Just this raw, deafening roar that seemed to shake the trees themselves. And then the scream. From the opposite slope, across the valley from where the roar was coming, another sound erupted, completely different but just as terrifying. High-pitched, piercing and sharp, staccato bursts of sound like a primate, but amplified, twisted, monstrously wrong. It reminded me, and I know this is going to sound crazy, of those documentaries you see about gibbons in the jungle, those long, wailing calls they make. But this wasn't a call. This was a shriek, a series of sharp, penetrating shrieks that ripped through the night, cutting right through the deep roar from the other side. This sound was sharper, more frantic, like something was in terrible pain or terrified itself. It echoed and re-echoed across the valley, playing back and forth against the roar, creating this insane, chaotic soundscape of pure, unadulterated horror. Jake was breathing hard now, almost hyperventilating. I could see the whites of his eyes in the darkness. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Uncle Matt, we gotta go. We gotta get out of here." His voice was shaking, barely a whisper, and then the worst part, movement. From uphill, close now, from the direction of the roar, we heard it. The sound of something big moving through the underbrush, not like a deer bounding away. This was heavy, deliberate, crushing branches and snapping twigs with every step. It was coming closer, quickly, directly towards us. I could hear the heavy thuds on the snow, rhythmic and powerful. Whatever was making that roar was moving downhill towards us, and it was big, real big. Fear, real, primal fear clamped down on me then. I've been in the woods my whole life. I've faced down bears, cornered bobcats, even had a run-in with a moose that thought I was encroaching on its territory. I know fear, and I know how to handle it usually. But this was different. This was wrong. The sounds, the sheer intensity of it all, the feeling that something ancient and monstrous was out there, just beyond the trees, hunting. It was fear that went deeper than just danger. It was a fear that touched something primal in me, something that said, "Run." Jake was pulling at me, tugging my jacket. "Uncle Matt, please, let's just go. We can come back tomorrow. Please." He was on the verge of tears. And honestly, I wasn't far behind him. I knew in that moment, rationally, logically, that we needed to get out of there. Now, whatever was making those sounds was not natural. It was not something I understood or wanted to understand. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. Okay, we're going. But then, stupidly, and I still kick myself for this, I thought of the coyote caller. It wasn't cheap. Probably cost me $150, and I wasn't about to just leave it out there in the woods. Stupid, right? Pride, maybe, or just plain dumb stubbornness. "Wait," I said to Jake. "Just wait here. I'm going to grab the caller. It's right there in the clearing. Just stay put." Jake's eyes widened in terror. "No, Uncle Matt, no, don't go back out there. Just leave it, please." But I was already moving. Stupid pride. Stupid gear lust. I pulled my rifle up, made sure it was loaded, flipped off the safety. "Just stay here," I said again, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll be right back, just a minute." I moved slowly, deliberately, pushing through the pines towards the clearing. The heavy footsteps were still coming, closer now, closer to us. Even if us now meant just Jake hidden back under the trees. The roar had subsided a little, but the shriek from the opposite slope was still going. Those high, piercing bursts of sound, echoing through the woods. I reached the edge of the clearing. The coyote caller was still there, sitting in the snow where we'd left it. In the dim, starlight, snow-reflected light, I could see it clearly, still humming faintly. I darted into the clearing, scooped up the caller, and turned to head back to Jake. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the tree line, where the thicker woods began uphill, I saw movement. Something dark, massive, moving between the trees. I couldn't make out details, not in that light, not through the trees, but I saw the sheer bulk of it, the size of it. It was huge, way bigger than a bear, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in those woods, or anywhere else for that matter. It moved with a heavy, powerful gait, and even from that distance, I could feel the weight of it, the presence of it. It was moving in our direction, my direction. Terror, real terror, hit me like a physical blow. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just turned and ran back to Jake, ran back towards Hemlock Road, ran like I had never run before in my life. I didn't even look back. I just ran. I stumbled back to Jake, who was huddled under the trees, trembling. "Run!" I yelled at him, my voice hoarse. "Run now! Don't stop!" We didn't need to be told twice. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, stumbling over fallen logs, scrambling downhill towards the road. I kept looking back, expecting to see something huge and dark breaking through the trees, chasing us. I could still hear the heavy footsteps behind us, but whether it was our own echoes or something else, I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to find out. The shrieking from the opposite slope had finally stopped, but the woods were still alive with a low, unsettling rumble, like the echo of that monstrous roar. We burst out onto Hemlock Road, gasping for breath, hearts hammering like mad. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Started the engine, slammed it into gear, and we were gone. Tires spitting snow, headlights cutting through the dark. We drove, and we didn't stop driving until we were back in Hemlock, back in town, back in the lights and the noise and the normalcy of it all. We didn't talk much on the way home. Jake was still pale and shaken, huddled in the passenger seat, staring out the window. I was still trembling, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just heard, what we'd just experienced. We got back to my place, went inside. My wife took one look at us and knew something was wrong. We told her. Well, we tried to tell her. But how do you explain something like that? How do you put into words sounds that felt like they came from another world? She thought we were just spooked by a bear, or maybe some wild dogs. She didn't understand. Nobody would understand. We never went back to Warren Woods that year. Not for coyotes, not for deer, not for anything. The thought of those sounds, that roar, that shriek, those heavy footsteps, it was enough to keep me away. For a long time, actually. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about it. I've been back to Warren Woods since then, of course. Hunting is in my blood, it's what I do. But it's different now. The woods feel different. Quieter, maybe. Or maybe I'm just listening harder now. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, it makes me jump. I always find myself listening for that roar, that shriek, waiting, knowing deep down that whatever made those sounds is still out there, somewhere in those woods, something big, something angry, something else. And the silence after, that's maybe the worst part, because sometimes, in the deep woods, when the wind dies down and everything goes still, sometimes I think I can still hear it. A faint echo of that roar, a whisper of that shriek carried on the wind. And I know it's not just the wind, it's something else, something waiting. And that's why I haven't been back to Warren Woods alone since then. And why I always bring a little more gun than I used to, just in case whatever it was that roared in the night decides to roar again. Story 9. It was just a stupid party, you know, out by Oakhaven, deep in the sticks. Mark's older brother threw it. Bonfire, kegs, the usual high school crap, even though I was a year out already, but whatever. Familiar faces are familiar faces. I didn't even want to go, to be honest. Felt like I was just going through the motions. But Sarah was going and, well, Sarah is Sarah. You get it. It was late when I left, way later than I should have. Mom's gonna kill me if I rolled in past one, probably already was. Everyone else was still hyped up, music blaring, bonfire still cracking, but I was tired. And honestly, the whole thing just felt hollow. I told Sarah I had to bail. She gave me that look, you know the one, those big eyes, like I was abandoning her or something. But she didn't stop me. Just said, drive safe, kind of quiet, like she was already drifting away, back into the noise and smoke. So I left. Got in my old pickup, that rust bucket of Dad's, and started down Oakhaven Road. Immediately, the music faded. Just the gravel crunching under the tires and the engine noise. Felt different instantly, like dropping out of a loud room into total silence. Oakhaven Road is paved for about half a mile from Matt Carver's place, and then it just turns to dirt, rutted and bumpy as hell. I took it slow, dust kicking up in my headlights. It was a moon night, almost full, made everything look silver and black, spooky almost, especially with the trees crowding in on both sides. No houses out there, just woods. Thick woods that go right down to the swamp in places. Silent Swamp, great name, right? Always gives me the creeps even in daylight. Dark water, weird trees with hanging moss, smells like damp earth and something else, something musky, kinda rotten. Not rotten like trash, but nature rotten, you know? Dead leaves, stagnant water, that kind of rot. Anyway, I was driving, windows down even though it was getting cooler, just to get some air. Kept glancing in my rear-view mirror. Just habit. Nothing ever back there. Oakhaven Road's pretty dead at night. Then I saw them. Headlights. Way back. Probably just someone else leaving the party late, I figured. Didn't think much of it. Just kept driving, watching the road, trying to avoid the worst of the potholes. But in the mirror, the headlights kept getting bigger. Faster than I expected. I was doing maybe 30, 35 on the dirt road, trying not to shake the truck apart. They were catching up fast. Weird. Maybe it was someone from the party being stupid, trying to race or something. Assholes. I sped up a little, just to see. The headlights sped up too, definitely catching me. Now they were close, real close, too close, closer than someone just driving normally. I glanced again, and they were right on my bumper practically. Could see the reflection in my tailgate, blindingly bright, and high, higher than a car or truck headlight should be, like way up high, like almost level with my rearview mirror. That didn't make any sense. My stomach tightened up a little. Something felt wrong, really wrong. It wasn't just someone tailgating. This felt different, predatory almost, like something was hunting. I sped up more, pushing the old truck harder than I should have on that road. Gravel was flying everywhere, engines screaming, looking in the mirror again, and the lights were still there, still close, still too high. And now I could see something else in the reflection, above the headlights. Something dark, blocking out the moonlight, tall, really tall. It wasn't a car anymore, definitely wasn't a truck. It was too tall, too massive. And it was moving way too fast, silently. I should have been able to hear another engine roaring that close, especially in the quiet of the woods. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own truck and something else. A different sound underneath. Faint, rustling, heavy breathing. I couldn't tell, over the engine, but something was there. Panic started to creep in. My heart was hammering. I jammed my foot down harder on the gas, praying the old truck wouldn't break down on me. I risked another glance. Closer. The dark shape was even bigger now, blocking out more of the sky. And lower down, in the headlight glare, I saw movement. Long, dark shapes moving at the edges of the light. Too many legs, branches? It was too dark to see properly, just flashes of movement distorted in the mirror. Then, out of nowhere, the woods on my left ended. Open space, stretching down to the swamp. I could smell it now, that swampy, earthy, rotten smell, stronger than before. And the moonlight was reflecting off the dark water in patches, making it look like pools of silver in the blackness. And that's when it happened. That's when it went from being scared to being completely, utterly terrified. The shape behind me wasn't just behind me anymore. It was coming out of the swamp. I saw it in the mirror, in the brief flash of moonlight reflecting off the water. A huge, dark shape rising up from the edge of the swamp, taller than any person, taller than my truck. Shifting, fluid, wrong. And the headlights, they weren't headlights. They were eyes, glowing, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's eyes caught in headlights, but huge, enormous, burning yellow in the darkness. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a truck. It was something else, something alive, something monstrous. I screamed. I don't even remember screaming, but I must have, because the sound ripped through me, mixed with the roaring engine and the screech of gravel. Pure, raw fear. I jerked the wheel hard. Truck swerved violently, tires skidding on the dirt, sending up clouds of dust. I went off the road, bouncing onto the rough verge, towards the swamp. No, away from the swamp. I meant to go away. But my hands were shaking so bad my brain was frozen. I fought the wheel, trying to get back onto the road, but the truck just kept sliding, bouncing deeper into the ditch beside the road, towards the trees again, towards the darkness. Then I hit something, hard, a rock, maybe a stump hidden in the ditch. The truck slammed to a stop, engine shuddering and dying. Everything went silent, except for my heart, pounding in my ears like a drum. Dead silence, dust slowly settling, moonlight filtering through the trees, the swamp smell thick and cloying, and the other sound, rustling. Closer now, much closer. I was stuck. Truck was dead, doors probably jammed. I was trapped. Terror. Absolute, paralyzing terror. I fumbled for the door handle, ripped at it, pulling with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. Driver's side door was wedged shut, probably by the impact. Passenger door. Tried that. Stuck too. Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. The rustling was louder now, closer, and now I could hear breathing. Heavy, ragged breaths, like something huge and winded right outside the truck, just beyond the thin metal door. I scrambled across the bench seat, banging my knees and elbows, fumbling for the passenger door handle again, still jammed. Panic clawed at my throat, choking me. I started kicking at the door, hard, uselessly. Metal groaned, but nothing moved. Then I remembered the window. Manual crank, stupid old truck. But maybe it still worked. I frantically rolled down the passenger window, cranking as fast as I could, knuckles scraping against the door panel. Finally, it was down. Enough to squeeze through. I shoved my head and shoulders through the opening, scraping my arms on the glass edge. Squeezed my body through, tearing my shirt, ripping skin on my side. Fell out onto the ground, landing hard in the dirt and weeds. Scrambled to my feet, heart bursting, lungs burning, looked back at the truck and saw it, standing at the edge of the road where the ditch began, blocking out the moonlight. Just a massive dark shape against the night sky, too tall, too wide, too wrong. The yellow eyes, burning like coals in the darkness, fixed on me, and it moved, not running, not even walking fast, just unfolding, unfurling like a dark cloud rolling towards me. Long limbs, impossibly long, extending from the shadows, reaching. I ran like I've never run before in my life. Away from the truck, away from the road, away from that thing. Into the woods, into the darkness, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes, stumbling over roots and rocks. I didn't care, just ran, blindly, desperately, for my life. Could hear it behind me, not running, no pounding footsteps, but movement, rustling, snapping branches, something heavy dragging through the undergrowth, and breathing, that heavy, ragged breathing, getting closer, closer. I didn't dare look back, just kept running, deeper and deeper into the woods, trying to put distance between me and that horror. Reached a fence, wire fence, stretched tight between wooden posts, tripped over it, fell sprawling into the mud on the other side. Didn't stop, got up, kept running, through more woods, more darkness, across a field, stumbling, falling, getting up again, adrenaline pumping through my veins, screaming in my ears. Then I saw it. The culvert, under the road. Drainage pipe, concrete, round, just big enough to crawl into. By the side of the road, half hidden by weeds and bushes. Salvation. Maybe just a temporary reprieve. But it was something, a place to hide. I dove for it, crawled on my hands and knees, pushing through the weeds, squeezing into the culvert opening. Darkness swallowed me. Cold, damp concrete pressed against my skin, smelled like earth and mildew and something metallic. Iron, blood. I didn't want to think about it. Crawled deeper into the culvert, as far as I could go, into the darkness, into the cold. Hunched over, knees drawn up to my chest, pressed against the damp concrete, trying to catch my breath, trying to stop shaking. Silence, except for my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Deafening in the silence. Listened, strainingly, desperately, for any sound, from outside, nothing, just the quiet of the night, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, crickets chirping. Normal night sounds, too normal, mockingly normal. Had it stopped? Had I lost it? Was it gone? Hope flickered, fragile and weak, then died, because I heard it, the rustling, closer again, outside the culvert now, on the road above, heavy footsteps on the gravel, slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing. It was there, right there, just above me, searching. Terror crashed over me again, wave after wave, cold terror, paralyzing terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, buried my face in my knees, tried to make myself as small as possible, to disappear into the concrete. Heard it moving around outside, pacing back and forth, Footsteps on the gravel above, then closer to the culvert opening. Heard something heavy scraping against the concrete edge, sniffing, smelling for me. Held my breath, stilling every muscle in my body, trying not to breathe, not to move, not to even exist. Just be nothing, invisible. Time stretched, minutes, hours, felt like forever. Trapped in the cold, dark culvert, listening to the monster pacing outside, hunting me. Knowing it was there, just inches away. Knowing it could find me, could reach in, could drag me out. I grabbed something, anything. My hand closed around a stick, lying in the dirt inside the culvert. A piece of broken branch, rough and splintered, a useless weapon. A pathetic defense, but it was something to hold on to. Clutched it tightly in my hand, knuckles white, listened, heart still hammering, but quieter now, more controlled. Terror was a cold weight in my chest, but also a sharp focus. Every sense heightened. Hearing every tiny sound from outside, the footsteps were still there, pacing, moving around, sometimes closer to the culvert opening, sometimes further away, but always there, always searching, and sometimes I thought I heard breathing again, that heavy, ragged breathing, closer now, right outside, just on the other side of the culvert wall, close enough to touch. I huddled deeper into the culvert, clutching the stick, paralyzed by fear. Waiting for it to find me, waiting for it to come for me, waiting to die. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The pacing footsteps faded, the rustling stopped, the breathing gone. Silence. Complete silence, except for the crickets chirping again, like nothing had ever happened. Was it gone? Really gone? Or just waiting, luring me out? Didn't move. Didn't breathe, stayed huddled in the culvert, frozen with fear for what felt like an eternity, listening, straining my ears, trying to hear any sound, any movement from outside. Nothing, just silence. Slowly, cautiously, I started to move, a tiny shift, then another, testing the waters, feeling the cold dread still clinging to me, thick and suffocating. Still nothing, just silence. And the night sounds, sounding almost mocking in their normalcy. After a long, long time, I don't know how long, felt like hours, maybe it was just minutes, time was meaningless in that culvert. I finally dared to crawl to the culvert opening, peered out, slowly, cautiously. Moonlight, road, trees, empty, nothing there, no sign of it, just the empty road bathed in moonlight stretching away into the darkness. Silence. Only the wind whispering through the trees. It was gone, or at least, it was gone from there. Slowly, trembling, I crawled out of the culvert, stood up, legs weak and shaky, knees buckling, looked around, frantically, scanning the road, the woods, the swamp in the distance. Nothing. But the fear was still there. A cold knot in my stomach, a trembling in my limbs, and a feeling, a certainty that it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting. I didn't go back to the truck, didn't even think about it, just started running again, back the way I'd come, towards home, along the road, running as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see those yellow eyes burning in the darkness behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the silent woods, the cold moonlight. I ran all the way home. Didn't stop running until I was banging on the front door, Mom opening it, blinking in surprise, asking me what was wrong. Why was I all covered in mud and leaves? Why was I crying? I couldn't tell her, couldn't explain. How could I? What would she say? Crazy, dreaming, drunk. Just mumbled something about the truck breaking down, about walking home, about being scared in the dark. She looked at me strangely, but didn't push it. Just told me to get cleaned up, get to bed. I showered, hot water scalding my skin, trying to wash away the fear, the cold, the swamp smell, the touch of that thing in my mind. But it wouldn't wash away. It was still there, stuck to me like mud and blood and darkness. Got into bed, sheets cold and clean against my skin, stared up at the ceiling in the dark, listened to the house sounds, the quiet hum of the fridge, the ticking clock downstairs, Mom and Dad asleep in their room. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But under it all, I could still hear it. The rustling, the breathing, the pacing footsteps in my head, behind my eyes, in the darkness just outside my window. I haven't been back to Oakhaven Road since. I take the long way around now, even if it adds 20 minutes to my drive. I can't go back there, can't even think about it without that cold terror gripping me again. And sometimes late at night, when the moon is full and the wind is blowing through the trees, I think I hear it again, faintly, just at the edge of hearing, the rustling, the breathing, the heavy footsteps pacing in the darkness. And I know it's still out there, in the swamp, watching, waiting, and I know with a cold certainty that chills me to the bone that someday it might find me again, and I won't be so lucky next time. Story 10. Okay, so this happened back in '94. Yeah, a long time ago now, but sometimes it feels like yesterday, you know? It's one of those things that just sticks with you, no matter how much time passes. My boy, Ethan, he was just 10 years old then. We were camping. It was October, perfect fall weather. Crisp air, leaves changing color, all that stuff. Willow Creek, beautiful little town. We were right near Shadowbrook National Forest. It's pretty deep woods out there, and we loved it. My dad, he came too. He always loved camping, taught me everything I knew about it. We set up our camp, you know, the usual routine. Tent up, fire pit going, got all our gear sorted. Ethan was bouncing off the walls excited. He loved being outdoors, loved hiking, exploring. That evening after dinner, it was just peaceful. Stars were out like crazy, the kind you only see when you're miles away from any city lights. The temperature had dropped just enough to make it perfect. That cool, fresh air that just fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. Ethan and I decided to take a walk down to Serene Lake. It wasn't far from our campsite, maybe 15-20 minutes on foot. There was a trail that led right to the edge of the lake, easy walk even in the dark. Moon was pretty bright, actually. Enough light to see the trail clearly, even with the trees all around. We walked side by side, just chatting about whatever 10-year-olds and their dads talk about. School, video games, stuff he was looking forward to, normal, everyday stuff. As we got closer to the lake, the woods started to get a bit denser. You could smell the dampness from the water, that earthy, mossy smell. We were walking along this part of the trail that skirted a sort of marshy area, kind of a boggy meadow right on the lake's edge. That's when we heard it. A loud crack, like a big branch snapping. It echoed through the woods, really sharp and loud against the quiet of the night. Both Ethan and I stopped dead in our tracks. We looked at each other. At first I thought maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something, just moving through the underbrush. But this was different. It sounded too heavy, too deliberate somehow. "What was that, Dad?" Ethan whispered, his voice a little shaky. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound casual, but I wasn't so sure myself. "Maybe another camper looking for firewood, you know." We stood there for a second, listening. Everything was silent again. Just the normal night sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the Halkar breeze. We started walking again, a little slower this time, a little more alert. And then we heard it again. Another crack, even louder this time. And then the sound of branches being ripped, like something really big was tearing through the trees. It was coming from the marshy meadow area, just off the trail to our left. Whatever it was close. I took Ethan's hand, and we stopped again, both of us staring into the woods in the direction of the noise. The moon was shining through the trees, making these patches of light on the forest floor. And then I saw them. In one of those patches of moonlight in a small clearing, maybe about 100 feet or so from the trail, there were two figures, just standing there, black shapes against the lighter trees in the background, tall, So incredibly tall. My heart just hammered in my chest. I couldn't breathe for a second. They weren't like people, not like anything I'd ever seen before. They were massive, upright, and they were moving, ripping at branches of trees, tearing chunks of bark off the trunks, like they were feeding. "Ethan, stay behind me," I whispered, pulling him closer. My mind was racing. Bears. Could they be bears? But these things were upright, walking on two legs, and they were huge. Bears aren't that tall when they stand up, are they? And they don't strip bark off trees like that. We just stood there, frozen, watching them. They didn't seem to notice us. They were too focused on whatever they were doing with the trees. The smaller of the two, even the smaller one, its arms, they were unbelievably long, reaching out, grabbing branches high up on the trees, just ripping them clean off. 10, 12 feet long, easy, those arms. The bigger one, it was even taller, even bulkier, more massive. It was hard to make out details in the moonlight, but they were definitely dark. Black shapes. Fear, real, cold fear, started creeping up my spine. This wasn't right, this wasn't normal. My brain was trying to catch up, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it wouldn't compute. Bears didn't do this. People didn't do this. Nothing I knew did this. We stayed there, crouched behind a big rock next to the trail. We must have been there for 15 minutes, maybe more, just watching. Ethan was silent, thank God. I think he was just as scared as I was, probably even more. Kids are more sensitive to these things, right? He was just glued to me, holding onto my leg, breathing fast. The two figures moved around the clearing, ripping and tearing at the trees, making this awful tearing, splintering sound. And then, suddenly, they both just stopped. They turned their heads, like they heard something, or sensed something. And then they both moved quickly, disappearing back into the deeper woods, into the darkness between the trees. Just gone. For a second, we just stayed crouched there, holding our breath, waiting, listening. Silence again, except for my heart pounding in my ears. And then another one came out of the woods, into the clearing. This one was even bigger than the first two. Colossal. It was like the others were big, but this was on a whole different scale. It stepped out of the trees into the moonlight, and it just towered. I swear it must have been 15 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were massive. Its head, I couldn't even really see its head clearly. It was just too high up in the shadows. But the size of it was just unreal. Terror, pure, unadulterated terror. That's what hit me then. Not just fear, but terror. The kind that freezes you in place and makes your blood run cold. I knew right then we had to get out of there, now. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we have to go, now, run." I didn't even look back. I grabbed Ethan's hand and we just bolted, ran back down the trail as fast as we could. We didn't say a word, we just ran like our lives depended on it, because in that moment, it felt like they did. I could hear my own breath ragged in my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ethan was right behind me, his small hand tight in mine, his little legs pumping as fast as he could. We didn't stop running until we burst back into our campsite, right into the firelight, right in front of my dad, who was sitting by the fire looking at us like we were crazy. Whoa, what's wrong?" he asked, startled. "What happened?" We were both gasping for breath, unable to speak for a minute. Ethan was clinging to me, shaking. I finally managed to get the words out, stammering, trying to explain what we'd seen. "Dad, there were things in the woods, by the lake, huge creatures." My dad just looked at me, confused at first, then a little concerned. "Creatures? What are you talking about? Did you see a bear?" "No," I said, shaking my head, still breathless. "Not bears. Bigger, way bigger, upright, walking on two legs. They were ripping trees apart." I tried to describe them, the size of them, the long arms, the way they moved. My dad listened, his eyebrows raised, a skeptical look on his face. When I was done, He just let out a kind of chuckle. "Sounds like you two saw some bears," he said, shrugging. "Bears can stand up, you know, and they're strong. Probably just bears." "But Dad, they weren't bears," I insisted. "They weren't like anything I've ever seen. They were huge, and there were 3 of them. The last one, it was enormous." He just shook his head. "It was dark out there, Thomas. You probably just got spooked. Shadows playing tricks on your eyes. It was bears or maybe deer. Lots of deer around here. You scared them. They ran off. That's all it was." I knew he didn't believe me. He thought we were just kids being scared by the woods at night, letting our imaginations run wild. But I knew what I'd seen. Ethan knew what he'd seen. It wasn't bears. It wasn't deer. It was something else. Something different. We didn't go back to sleep very easily that night. Ethan and I huddled in the tent, listening to every sound outside. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. I couldn't shake the image of those figures from my mind, especially that last one, that massive silhouette against the moonlit clearing. The next morning, my dad was already up making coffee when we came out of the tent. He was cheerful, acting like nothing had happened, like it was just a normal camping morning. He made pancakes, we ate breakfast, but I couldn't forget what we'd seen. I needed to know. After breakfast, I told my dad I wanted to go back to the lake, to the place where we'd seen them. He rolled his eyes, but he let me go. He said he'd stay at camp with Ethan. I think he was still skeptical, but maybe he was a little curious too. I walked back to Serene Lake alone. It was daylight now. The woods looked different in the sunlight, less menacing. But as I got closer to the marshy area, that feeling of unease started to come back. My heart started to beat faster again. I found the clearing. It wasn't hard to spot, and as soon as I stepped into it, I saw the evidence. It was everywhere. Branches ripped off trees, thick branches, as thick as my arm, just snapped clean off. Bark stripped from the trunks of trees in long, jagged strips. Fresh breaks, fresh damage. This wasn't old stuff. This had happened last night, and the size of the damage, it was incredible. The branches were ripped off way too high for a bear to reach standing on its hind legs. The bark was torn off at heights that no deer could reach, even stretching up, and there were footprints in the soft earth near the marshy edge of the clearing. Big footprints, not like bear prints, more human-shaped, but huge, so much bigger than human footprints. I spent a long time in that clearing, just looking around, trying to make sense of it all, trying to understand what had happened. The evidence was right there in front of me. Broken branches, stripped bark, massive footprints. Something had been there, something big and powerful, something that had ripped those trees apart. I went back to camp, and I showed my dad what I'd found. The broken branches, the bark. I described the footprints. He looked at the evidence, and I could see that even he was starting to get a little less skeptical. He didn't say anything. He just looked around, his face getting more and more serious. We packed up camp later that day and drove home. We didn't talk about it much on the way back. It was like we didn't know what to say. My dad never really admitted that he believed me, but he never dismissed it as bears again either. And Ethan and I, we knew. We knew what we'd seen. We knew it wasn't our imagination. It was real, and it was terrifying. To this day, I can't explain it. I've read about things, creatures in the woods, legends, stories, rumors, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I never really believed in any of that stuff before, but after that night in Shadowbrook National Forest, I don't know what to believe anymore. I've gone back to Willow Creek a few times since then, camping again, hiking, but I've never gone back to Serene Lake at night, never walked that trail after dark again. And every time I'm in the woods, especially at night, I can't help but think about those black figures in the moonlight. And I can't help but wonder, what were they? And are they still out there, waiting? I don't know. And I don't think I ever will. But I'll never forget that night. Never. It just stays with you. Story 11. It was November, late November, 99, right before Thanksgiving. I was driving for Schneider back then, hauling. I don't even remember what I was hauling now. Doesn't matter. What matters is, I was dead tired. I'd been on the road for days, pushing hard to get back to Vale Seco. My wife, Maria, was waiting for me, and I was missing my own bed, something fierce. Plus, Thanksgiving, turkey and all that. Anyway, I was on Highway 18, that stretch through Desolation County. Desolation County. They weren't kidding with that name. Nothing out there, just rocks and scrub brush and then more rocks. Pitch black at night too, like someone turned off the lights on the whole world. And quiet. Man, the quiet was something else. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I'd been fighting sleep for a good couple of hours. Coffee doing about as much good as tap water. I knew I needed to pull over. Safety first. That's what they drill into you, right? But every rest stop was packed, and I didn't want to lose more time searching for a spot. I figured I'd just find a wide shoulder somewhere and grab a few hours of shut-eye, just enough to get me safely home in the morning. And then I saw it. Just off the side of the highway, a little dirt pull-off. Looked like truckers used it sometimes. Tire tracks in the dirt and a few bits of trash blowing around. Perfect. Isolated, nobody around, just what I needed. I signaled, pulled over, and shut down the big rig. Engine coughs a few times, and then silence. That heavy desert silence. I killed all the lights except my parking lights, just for safety, in case some other poor soul was driving as late as I was. Then I stretched, cracked my back, and yawned so hard my jaw popped. Man, I was beat. I climbed down out of the cab, intending to take a leak before I crashed out in the sleeper. The air was cold, desert cold, dry as dust. But it was something else in the air too. Something thick, like a smell. And not a good smell. It was putrid, like something dead, like a skunk, but worse. Much, much worse. It hit me the second I stepped out, just slammed into my nose, made my stomach churn right then and there. Damn, I muttered to myself, wrinkling my nose. What the hell died out here? I figured it was just some roadkill, maybe a coyote or something, decomposing in the desert heat, even if it was November. Still, it was nasty. I started moving around to the passenger side of the rig to get away from the wind, thinking maybe it was blowing from behind the truck, bringing the smell with it. That's when I heard it. The sound of rocks. Not just little pebbles skittering down, but like big rocks, moving, coming from up the slope of the mountain on the side of the road. It was hard to place exactly in the dark, but it sounded like it was up there, somewhere on the steep hillside that rose right beside the highway shoulder. Huh, I thought, probably just some animals, deer maybe. But deer don't make that kind of noise. It sounded heavier, clumsier, more like something big. And whatever it was moving downhill, coming closer to the road. The smell got stronger then. Jesus, it was overpowering. It wasn't just skunk anymore. It was rotten, like meat left out in the sun for a week, mixed with, I don't know, something else, something musky and wild. It clawed at my throat, made my eyes water. I almost gagged right there. I stopped what I was doing, peeing, forgotten. My head swiveled, trying to see into the darkness up the mountain. Just blackness. My headlights only reached so far, cutting tunnels through the night, but the slope was too steep, too dark for them to light anything up there. The rock sounds came again, louder this time, closer. Whatever it was definitely coming down, and fast. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like when you know someone is watching you, but amplified, way stronger. Something wasn't right. Something felt seriously wrong, and then I saw it. Just for a split second, but I saw it. A shadow, a huge dark shadow that moved across the beam of my headlights. It wasn't like an animal silhouette, like a deer jumping across the road. It was different, thicker, wider, and darker, like it swallowed the light. It went from one side of the headlight beam to the other so fast it was just a blur. But it was big, really big. And then it stepped into the light. or not exactly stepped, more like lumbered, stumbled. It came out of the darkness on the mountainside and crossed the road in front of my truck, and I just stood there, frozen, like my feet were glued to the ground. It was hairy. That's the first thing that hit me. Covered in hair, long, matted, tangled hair, dark brown, almost black in the dim light. And it was massive, taller than my truck. No, not taller than the cab, but damn near. Definitely taller than the trailer. I'm 6 feet even, maybe a hair over, and this thing towered over me. I'd guess 7.5 feet tall, easy. It was walking upright, kind of, but hunched over too. Like it was too big for its own body, or like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. Its arms, Jesus, its arms were long. They hung down past its knees, thick, muscled, like tree trunks, covered in that same shaggy hair. I could see the fingers, even in the poor light, long fingers, thick, ending in nails, claws. I couldn't tell for sure. It was too dark, too fast. And the smell. It was right on top of me now, rolling off of it in waves. It was so strong it felt like I could taste it. Rotting meat, musk, and something else. Something wild, animalistic, and ancient. It was like pure, concentrated decay. It grunted, not like a pig, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, a sound that rumbled up from its chest and echoed out into the night. A low growl, but louder, much louder than any dog or bear growl I'd ever heard. More like a roar, but held back, a threat, a promise of violence. It didn't even look at me. It was just focused on crossing the road, moving away from the mountainside and where? Into the other side of the desert? There was nothing but more desert out there as far as I knew. It took maybe 5, maybe 8 seconds for it to cross in front of my truck and disappear into the darkness on the other side of the highway. 5 to 8 seconds. It doesn't sound like long, does it? But it felt like forever, like time stretched out, and every second was an eternity of fear. I just watched it go. Couldn't move. Couldn't breathe almost. Just watched it lumber away, its massive dark shape fading into the blackness beyond the reach of my headlights. The sound of rocks crunching under its feet, the heavy, uneven footfalls faded away into the silence. The stench lingered, though. That awful, sickening smell hung in the air, coating my lungs, stinging my eyes. And then, nothing. Silence. Darkness. Just the smell and the ringing in my ears from the silence and the pounding of my heart in my chest. Boom, 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 like a drum beating in my ribs. I stood there for, I don't know how long, maybe a minute, maybe longer, just staring into the darkness where it had gone, trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made. It didn't fit into anything I knew. Bigfoot. That was the first thing that popped into my head. Bigfoot, like those cheesy shows on TV. But no, this was real, too solid, too terrifying. And the smell? Bigfoot shows never mentioned the smell. And those things on TV, they never looked like that. This wasn't some goofy, cartoonish creature. This was something else, something wild and dangerous and ancient. Terror. That's the only word for what I felt. Pure, unadulterated terror. My legs started shaking, like they had a mind of their own. My hands were trembling so bad I couldn't even make a fist. My teeth were chattering, even though it wasn't even that cold out. Just that desert chill. I snapped out of it then, like a switch flipped in my head. Escape, that's all I could think about. Gotta get out of here. Gotta get away from this place, now. I turned and stumbled back to the cab of my truck. Didn't even think about peeing anymore. Didn't think about sleeping. Just getting the hell out of there. I yanked the door open, scrambled up into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut and locked it, click, click, like that would do any good, against something like that. Key in the ignition. Turn. Engine roared to life. Put it in gear. Release the brakes. And I floored it. tires spitting gravel and dirt. The big rig lurched forward back onto the highway. I didn't even look back. Didn't check my mirrors. Just kept my foot mashed on the gas pedal, hauling ass down Highway 18, away from that place. Away from it. I drove straight through to Vale Seco. Didn't stop. Didn't even slow down unless I had to. Drove like a bat out of hell, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Sun came up. Traffic started picking up. People started to appear again. Houses, gas stations, signs of civilization. And with every mile, I felt a little bit of that icy grip around my heart loosen. Finally, I pulled into the Schneider yard, exhausted, shaking, and still smelling that goddamn smell in my nose. Parked the rig, turned in my paperwork and went straight home. Maria was waiting for me, thank God. Hugs, kisses, the smell of turkey cooking. Felt like I was back in the real world again. I never told her. Never told anyone, actually, for years. Who would believe me? Bigfoot in Desolation County. Sounds like a joke. And I didn't want to be a joke. I just wanted to forget it ever happened. Pretend it was a dream. A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and bad coffee. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. I know what I heard. And I know I will never, ever drive Highway 18 again. Not at night. Not ever. That stretch of road. There's something out there. Something old. Something wild. Something evil. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. I just hope I never see it again. Sometimes even now when I'm driving late at night on some lonely highway, I catch a whiff of something wrong, something rotten and musky and wild, and my heart skips a beat, and I look in my mirrors, and I speed up just in case it's still out there waiting in the darkness, watching. Story 12. Now this wasn't just any cemetery. It was supposed to be ancient, way back from the 1800s, abandoned, the whole shebang. We'd heard stories, whispers mostly, about it being haunted, creepy stuff you tell each other around a campfire, not really believing any of it, but just to get a reaction. But this night, for some reason, it sounded like a brilliant idea. We were bored, pumped with energy drinks, and probably looking to prove we weren't scared of anything. Stupid, I know. We grabbed flashlights, those big clunky ones that weighed a ton, and took off. Getting to the cemetery was already a bit of an adventure. We had to walk along the train tracks for a while. It was pitch black, except for our flashlight beams cutting through the dark. The train tracks themselves were unsettling at night, those heavy metal rails humming faintly even when no train was coming, just this constant low vibration you could feel in your feet. Then we cut off the tracks onto this path. Path is probably too generous. It was more like a deer trail, overgrown and winding through the woods. The trees were thick, blocking out any moonlight. It got darker and quieter the further in we went. The sounds from the camp, the music, the chatter, faded away until it was just us, the rustling of leaves and our own breathing. I remember feeling that little prickle of unease on the back of my neck. Even then, you try to tell yourself it's nothing, just your imagination running wild, but that feeling is there, a little nudge that something's not quite right. When we finally got to the cemetery, it was even worse than I'd imagined. The stories hadn't exaggerated. It was old, seriously old. Tombstones were cracked, leaning over, some completely toppled. Moss was everywhere, thick green blankets on the stones, making the inscriptions almost impossible to read. There were these crypts too, small stone buildings, some with doors hanging off their hinges like gaping mouths open in the dark. It smelled damp and earthy, and something else, something I couldn't place, almost sweet but rotten at the same time. Definitely not a nice smell. We spread out a bit, flashlights dancing around, trying to read names and dates on the stones. The dates were insane, like 1840-something, 1870-something. These people had been dead for longer than my grandparents had been alive. It made it feel heavy, you know? Like we were trespassing on something ancient and forgotten, something that wanted to stay forgotten. At first it was just that nervous excitement, the thrill of being somewhere you're not supposed to be, somewhere a bit spooky. We were joking around, trying to scare each other, jumping out from behind tombstones, stupid stuff. But after a while, the jokes started to die down. The silence of the cemetery was heavy, pressing in on you. The flashlights seemed weak against the darkness, like tiny pinpricks of light that just highlighted how much we couldn't see. We wandered around for maybe an hour, maybe a bit less. The feeling of unease kept growing. It wasn't any one thing, just a collection of small things. The way the shadows moved, even when there wasn't any wind. The way the trees around the edge of the cemetery seemed to lean in, watching us. That smell just hanging in the air, getting stronger. And the silence, that oppressive silence that felt like it was listening back. Eventually, someone, I think it was Sarah, said she was getting creeped out and wanted to go back. It was like she spoke for all of us. Everyone suddenly seemed ready to leave. We turned around, retracing our steps back towards the train tracks. The relief of heading back was instant. Even the thought of the train tracks, which had felt a bit scary before, now felt welcoming, like a path back to safety. We were walking faster now, trying to put distance between ourselves and the cemetery. We were back on the tracks, walking side by side, our flashlights cutting a path ahead of us. We were almost out of the woods, could start to hear the distant sounds from the camp again when it happened. Isabella screamed, just this raw, piercing scream that ripped through the night. It wasn't a playful scream or a startled scream. It was pure, unfiltered terror. We all froze, hearts hammering. My blood went cold instantly. For a second, I thought she'd seen a snake or something on the tracks, something normal, but then I saw where she was pointing her flashlight. It was up ahead to our right beyond the tracks. There was this structure. I'd never seen anything like it before, but later I found out it was an old coal tower. Apparently, they used to use them to load coal onto trains, back when there was still a mine around there decades ago. Now it was just this skeleton of wood, rotting and skeletal against the night sky. It was tall, really tall, looming over everything. 40, 50 feet maybe. Just this dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. And at the very top of this tower, silhouetted against the stars, was something. A shape, darker than the tower itself. Monstrous. I couldn't make out details at first. It was just this huge, hulking shape up there. Our flashlights, everyone's, started swinging towards it, beams converging on the top of the tower. That's when it moved, and it wasn't like an animal shifting its weight. It was deliberate. It shifted, then launched itself, jumped from the top of the tower, from that height. It just jumped. And it wasn't graceful, but it wasn't clumsy either. It was wrong. As it came down, you could see it more clearly in the flashlight beams. It was dark, impossibly dark, like it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. It was big, too big. Humanoid in shape maybe, but distorted, stretched out. And its arms, God, its arms. They were long, way too long, hanging down, dangling as it fell, and they looked hairy, covered in thick, dark hair. It hit the ground. We were all expecting this huge crash, a bone-jarring thud, but there was nothing, almost nothing, just this soft landing, like it had jumped off a curb, not off a 50-foot tower. It was muffled, wrong. Then silence, absolute, stunned silence. We were all frozen, flashlights fixed on the spot where it had landed, in the undergrowth next to the tracks. We couldn't see anything in there, just darkness and the tangled bushes. For a long, long moment, nothing happened. Then the sound of snapping branches, cracking and breaking, moving away from the tracks, deeper into the woods. Whatever it was moving away from us. We just stood there, paralyzed. The image of that thing on the tower, launching itself off, burned into my brain. The soft landing, the disappearing into the darkness, the cracking branches. It felt unreal, like a nightmare, but we were all awake, all seeing it. And then it screamed again. Not Isabella this time. The creature, that thing, it screamed. And that scream, I can't even describe it. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. Not like anything I've ever heard. It was high-pitched, piercing, like metal scraping against metal, but with this raw, animalistic edge to it. It went on and on, this blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, filling the night with pure, unadulterated horror. That scream. That's what broke us. We just turned and ran, full-out sprint. Back the way we came, along the tracks, stumbling, falling, scrambling to our feet, not caring about anything except getting away from that sound, away from whatever was out there in the woods. Flashlights bounced wildly, casting crazy shadows, making everything seem even more disorienting. We were yelling, shouting, gasping for breath, but mostly just running, driven by pure, blind terror. We didn't stop running until we burst back into the campsite, lights blazing, music still playing, people laughing, oblivious to what we had just seen. We stumbled into the clearing, panting, wild-eyed, babbling. It took a while for anyone to even understand that something was wrong, seriously wrong. We tried to explain about the cemetery, the tower, the thing, the scream, but it sounded insane. It sounded like a made-up story, a campfire legend we'd somehow convinced ourselves was real. People looked at us like we were crazy, like we'd been smoking something we shouldn't have. No one believed us, except maybe Isabella. She was white as a sheet, eyes wide, still shaking. She'd seen it too. She'd screamed first. We stayed up all night, huddled around the campfire, too scared to sleep, jumpy at every sound. The screams kept playing in my head, that monstrous shriek echoing over and over. The image of that thing falling from the tower, the long arms swinging, the soft landing, I couldn't shake it. In the morning, everything felt different. The sunlight felt weak, like it couldn't chase away the darkness of the night before. We told the camp counselors, trying to make them understand what we'd seen, what we'd heard. They listened, nodded, and told us it was probably just an owl or a deer, maybe a bear. A bear jumping off a tower, landing like a cat, screaming like that. They just didn't want to deal with it. They just wanted us to calm down and forget about it. We went home that day. Everyone was quiet on the drive back, still stunned. We talked about it a few times after, trying to make sense of it, trying to piece together what we'd seen, but it was impossible. It didn't fit into any explanation, any category. It was just wrong. I've tried to forget it over the years, tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, mass hysteria, teenage imaginations running wild. But I can't. I can still see it, clear as day, that shape on top of the tower, launching itself into the night. I can still hear that scream in my nightmares sometimes, and every now and then when I'm out in the woods at night, even now, all these years later, I'll hear a twig snap or the wind rustle through the trees, and that feeling comes back, that cold, primal fear. And I think, what if it's still out there? What if it's still out there in the woods, somewhere in the dark, watching, listening, waiting? I don't know what it was we saw that night. I have no explanation. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to find out. Some things are better left unknown. Some nights the darkness just holds things you're not meant to see, things you can't explain, things that scream in the night and vanish without a trace, and you're just left with the memory and the fear. That's it. Story 13. Okay, so, this happened back in 1998, summer of '98. Man, just saying it feels like a lifetime ago, but then sometimes it feels like it was yesterday. I was at summer camp. Pine Woods Camp, out in the middle of nowhere, felt like it anyway. I was 9 years old, and we were doing this massive game of hide and seek, not just like around the cabins or anything. The counselors were letting us use almost the whole camp, which sounds cool now, but back then, well, you'll see. It was afternoon, real hot, the kind of humid, sticky heat that hangs in the air and just sits on you. I remember the sun was filtering down through the trees in stripes, making these hot spots on the ground. Everything smelled like pine and dirt and that weird, sweet smell of summer camp food that always seemed to be in the air. I was with the Pioneer Cabin group. We were supposed to find the kids from Webster Cabin, and they were hiding all over. It sounded fun at first, but camp woods aren't exactly like your backyard. It's bigger, quieter, and even in the daytime, it can get real shadowy, real quick. I was running trying to cut through this part of the woods between Pioneer and Webster. I was so focused on trying to find someone, anyone, from Webster, that I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. I was crashing through the undergrowth, pushing branches out of my face, yelling out, "Webster Cabin, you guys here?" like an idiot. I was really into winning, you know? 9-year-old brain. Winning hide and seek was basically life or death back then. Then it happened. I was running too fast, not looking down, and my foot caught on something. I went down hard, tripped right over a fallen log, sprawled out on the ground, stung my hands and knees, scraped them up good on the leaves and dirt. I remember cursing under my breath, annoyed more than hurt at first. I pushed myself up, spitting out dirt and leaves, ready to get back to the game when I saw it. Right there, not even 10 feet away from where I'd fallen, standing by a tree. It was Jesus. Even now, after all these years, just thinking about it, the hair on my arm stands up. It was tall. Really tall. I mean, taller than any of the counselors, taller than my dad, taller than anyone I had ever seen. And it was covered in fur. Dark, matted brown fur. Like bear fur, but thicker, messier. But it wasn't a bear. I knew that instantly. Bears don't stand like that. Bears don't look like that. It was upright, standing against a big oak tree, kind of leaning against it with one arm, like it was just chilling. But that's the thing. Nothing about it was chill. It was monstrous. That's the only word for it. Monstrous. Its body was humanoid, I guess, is the closest word. It had shoulders, arms, legs, but everything was wrong. Too big, too long, too off. The proportions were all messed up. And then there was the head. Oh God, the head. It was shaped sort of like a human head, but elongated, stretched out. The face, it was vaguely human too, in a sick, twisted way. Like someone had taken a human face and just pulled and distorted it until it was something else entirely. It had a broad, heavy bone structure. I remember thinking about bones like I could see them right under the skin, or fur, or whatever it was. The nose, it was weird, like pinched and pointed, but also wide and flat at the same time. And the mouth was the worst. It was wide, so wide and threatening. It wasn't smiling, it wasn't snarling, it was just there. A wide, dark line in that grotesque face, like it could open up and swallow you whole. I could see teeth, but they weren't like human teeth. They were uneven, yellowish, some pointy, some flat, like a mix of different animals. And way too many of them. It was leaning against the tree, one massive arm propped up. I could see its hand. It was huge, covered in the same dark, matted fur, with long, thick fingers. I couldn't see nails, but I could imagine them, long and black and sharp. Just one of those hands could probably crush my head like a grape. And then there were the eyes. That's what really got me. That's what I see when I close my eyes sometimes, even now. Its eyes met mine, just for a split second. But it felt like forever. They were dark. Completely black, I think, or maybe just so dark brown they looked black and empty. There was nothing behind them. No kindness, no meanness, no anger, no anything. Just blankness, void. And that's what made it so terrifying. It was like staring into something that wasn't alive, even though it was clearly standing right there, breathing, watching me. A primal terror just flooded me. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before or since. It wasn't the kind of fear you get when you watch a scary movie or almost fall off your bike. This was different, deeper, older. It felt like something ancient just woke up inside me and screamed, "Danger!" And I screamed, I mean really screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting scream that just ripped out of me. I didn't even realize I was doing it until it was happening. My voice was cracking, it was so loud and uncontrolled. The creature, it didn't react how I thought it would. In the movies, the monster would roar or attack or something. But this thing, it just moved, slowly, deliberately. It pushed itself off the tree trunk with that massive hand and just turned and walked away. It didn't run. It didn't rush. It just stepped away from the tree, turned its back to me, and walked into the deeper woods. It was unbelievably silent. For something that big, you'd think it would make noise, snapping branches, rustling leaves. But no, it just moved silently, effortlessly, like it was gliding through the trees. And it disappeared. Just gone. Like it had melted into the shadows. I kept screaming. I couldn't stop. My scream was echoing back at me through the trees. It sounded pathetic and small and utterly alone. I was frozen to the spot, staring at the place where it had been, where it had vanished, just an empty patch of woods now. But my brain was still screaming. My heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. Finally, I don't know how long it was, but it felt like ages. My legs started to work again. They were shaky, trembling, but they moved. I turned and ran. Not in any direction, just away. Away from that spot, away from the woods, away from it. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the trees and back into the camp clearing, right in front of Pioneer Cabin. My cabin. I remember seeing the familiar wooden walls, the porch, the green door, and it was like coming back to life, like air rushing back into my lungs. My cabin mates were there on the porch, laughing, still playing hide-and-seek, completely oblivious to anything. They looked up when they saw me, all red-faced and out of breath. "Caleb, where were you? We were looking for you," one of them said. Tommy, I think it was. I couldn't even speak at first. I was gasping for air, tears streaming down my face, snot running out of my nose. I'm sure I looked like a complete mess. I probably sounded like a mess too when I finally managed to choke out words. I saw something, I stammered. In the woods. Something big and hairy and scary. They all just stared at me, then started to laugh. Camp kids, you know. "What? You saw a squirrel? Maybe it was Mr. Henderson in his bear costume." They thought I was joking, or just being a scaredy cat. I tried to explain. "No, it wasn't a squirrel. It was like a monster, really tall, with fur and a weird face." But the more I tried to describe it, the more ridiculous it sounded, even to myself. Hairy monster in the woods. Yeah, right. 9-year-olds and their imaginations. The counselors came over then, seeing all the commotion. Mr. Johnson, he was our head counselor. He was a nice guy, always trying to be cool and understanding. He knelt down and asked me what was wrong. I told him too what I'd seen. I tried to explain about the creature, about the woods, about being scared. He listened, he nodded, he did the whole reassuring adult thing. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me either. He thought I was just freaked out because I got lost, probably saw a deer or something, and my imagination ran wild. He told me it was okay. It was just the woods playing tricks on me. There were no monsters in Pinewoods Camp, that sort of thing. He said maybe I should just take it easy for the rest of the afternoon, hang out at the cabin. He even got me a juice box. Grape. I remember it was grape. I drank it, but it didn't make me feel any better. Nobody believed me. Not the counselors, not the other kids. They all just laughed it off, forgot about it pretty quickly. They went back to their games, back to camp life. But I couldn't. I couldn't forget. I sat on the cabin porch the rest of the afternoon, staring out at the woods, the same woods where it had happened. The sun was still shining, the birds were still singing, everything looked normal. But it wasn't normal. Not to me. Everything felt different, tainted somehow. Like I knew something they didn't, something dark and secret that was hiding just beyond the trees. I didn't tell anyone about it again. What was the point? They wouldn't believe me. And honestly, part of me started to wonder if maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a weird shadow, my mind playing games. Maybe I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I saw. I felt the terror. I saw its eyes. And that feeling, that cold, gut-wrenching fear, that was real. That was as real as anything I've ever experienced. I finished out camp, went home a week later. Summer ended, school started, life went on. But that day, that afternoon in the woods, it never really left me. It's always there, in the back of my mind, a shadow in my memory. And every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, hiking or something, and the sun starts to go down, and the shadows get long, I can't help but think about it. I can't help but look around just for a second to see if it's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was. I don't know what I saw. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. The not knowing. The unanswered question that just hangs in the air, cold and heavy, all these years later. It's just out there. And I saw it. And that's my story. I don't have any explanation, no grand theory, no nothing. Just that one moment in the woods. And I've carried it with me ever since. Story 14. Okay, so I don't usually do this, like post stuff online, especially not this kind of thing. But I saw this forum, and it's kind of specific. And honestly, I've been carrying this around for almost 40 years and never really talked about it to anyone outside the group that was there. Maybe writing it out, for people who might actually get it, will help somehow. Doubt it, but whatever. This was back in '85, hunting trip with my dad, uncle, and 3 family friends. All seasoned guys, been doing this their whole lives. We went up to this spot near Campo Santo, big woods, deep woods. Heard stories about the place naturally. Old graveyards, weird stuff, the usual small-town legends. But we never put much stock in that crap. We were there for deer and elk. It was early November, first real bite of winter in the air. We set up camp deep in the woods, not far from this old, abandoned cemetery, Campo Santo. Creepy name for it, even then. First night, we get the fire going, talking and laughing, hunter stuff. Fire crackling, the woods quiet around us, normal. We're in 2 trailers, a big 5th wheel that my Uncle Thomas owned, and a smaller pull behind a little ways off where me and my dad were. Around maybe midnight, things went different. It started subtly, a sound from the woods. At first it was faint, kind of distant. We all stopped talking, looked at each other. It was like a scream, but not human. More animal, but too high-pitched, too drawn out. Imagine a coyote, but stretched out and way louder, and with this really disturbing edge to it. Like pain, but also something else. We all just froze. My dad, he was the first to speak, real low voice. "Coyote?" he says, but even he didn't sound convinced. Uncle Thomas chuckled, nervous-like, probably just some bobcat screaming its lungs out. The other guys, Elias, Frank, and old man Jenkins, just nodded, trying to act like it was nothing. We started talking again, louder this time, trying to drown it out. But then it happened again. Closer now, louder. This time it was unmistakable. It was a scream, like pure agony. Not like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't barking, it wasn't howling, it was just screaming. Raw, visceral, bone-chilling. It went on for a good minute, maybe longer, echoing through the trees. The fire seemed to crackle louder, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. We all stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. Nobody said anything for a long time. The comfortable vibe we had was completely gone. It was replaced by this thick, heavy feeling in the air. Fear, pure and simple. Even the toughest guys in our group, they looked rattled. Jenkins, he was usually cracking jokes, but he was pale and quiet. "All right, that's something else," Frank finally mumbled, breaking the silence. That ain't no bobcat. Maybe a mountain lion, Elias offered, but again his voice lacked conviction. Mountain lions are scary, yeah, but they don't scream like that. Not like... that. Thomas tried to play it off again. Probably just messing with us. Let's just ignore it. Goes away eventually. He tried to sound confident, but I could see his hands shaking as he reached for his coffee. We tried to go back to talking, but it was pointless. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, we all jumped. The silence between those sounds felt heavy, expectant. We stayed up later than planned, feeding the fire, talking in hushed tones about everything except what we were all really thinking. Eventually, exhaustion won, and we all retreated to our trailers. Sleeping that night was tough. Every little sound from outside felt amplified, threatening. I kept waking up, heart pounding, listening. The woods were usually a comforting sound, like nature breathing, but that night they felt hostile, like they were holding secrets we didn't want to know. I think we all slept with one ear open, waiting for that scream again. It came back. Must have been around 3 in the morning, I think, but this time it was different. It was closer, much closer, and louder. It wasn't just echoing in the distance, it felt like it was right outside the camp. It ripped through the night, that same gut-wrenching scream, but now it was so intense, so full of something terrible it made your teeth ache. This time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't an animal. Not any animal any of us had ever heard or could even imagine. It was something else, something wrong. From our trailer we could hear rustling in the undergrowth, like something big moving around out there. The screams kept coming, not constant, but in intervals, each one making the hair on your arms stand on end. It sounded like it was circling the camp, getting closer each time. My dad got out of bed, grabbed his rifle. I did too, even though I felt stupid holding it inside the trailer. Like it would do any good against whatever was making that noise. From the fifth wheel, we heard commotion too. Muffled voices, then the creak of the trailer settling as someone moved around inside. The screams kept getting closer. It felt like they were coming from right outside the trailer walls. I remember just sitting there, frozen, rifle gripped tight, listening to my own heart pound against my ribs, louder than anything else. Then it happened. The screaming got unbelievably close. It was like it was right outside our window, pressing against the thin aluminum skin of the trailer. The sound was so loud, so raw, it felt like it was vibrating in my bones. It reached a crescendo, this unbelievable shriek of pure terror and rage mixed together. Then, from the fifth wheel, we heard it, clear as day, Uncle Thomas yelling, "What the hell?" His voice was thick with panic, raw with fury. Then, the sound of the trailer door being thrown open hard, a heavy thud. Then, more yelling from Thomas, "Get away from me!" And then gunfire, 3 deafening blasts of a rifle in rapid succession. The smell of gunpowder instantly filled the air, even inside our trailer. My dad and I stared at each other, eyes wide. What the hell was happening? And then the scream came again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just agonizing, it was victorious, triumphant, and louder, immeasurably louder than anything before. It was like the sound itself had physically grown, expanded to fill the entire woods. It drowned out everything else. It was the most terrifying sound I have ever and will ever hear in my life. It was so loud, so intense, it felt like it was pushing on my eardrums, about to burst them. It was inhuman. It was otherworldly. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Just silence. Deafening, ringing silence. We waited, holding our breath, listening. For what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, there was nothing, just the faint crackle of embers from the dying campfire, the wind whispering through the trees, and the frantic pounding of my heart in my ears. Then the fifth wheel door creaked open again, slowly this time. We heard footsteps, heavy and uneven, coming back to the trailer. The door of the fifth wheel opened, and Uncle Thomas stumbled inside. Elias's voice, hushed and scared. Tom! Tom, what happened? What was that?" Thomas just stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, shaking, violently shaking. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, gasping for breath, like he'd run a marathon. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, hoarse and broken, he said, I saw it." "Saw what, Tom? What was screaming?" Frank asked, voice trembling. Thomas stumbled further into the trailer, leaning against the wall. His eyes were wide, staring, pupils blown wide even in the dim light. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Worse than a ghost. He swallowed hard, throat clicking. "A monster," he whispered. "I saw a monster." He started to tremble harder. His teeth were chattering. Elias moved closer to him, trying to put a hand on his shoulder, but Thomas flinched away like he'd been burned. "It was huge," Thomas mumbled, still shaking, "covered in hair, like an animal. But it stood up, on two legs, taller than anything. 7, 8 feet tall, easy, maybe more." He kept looking over his shoulder, like it was still standing right behind him. "What are you talking about, Tom? What did you see?" Dad called out from our trailer. We were glued to the doorway, listening, not daring to go out. "Monster?" Thomas repeated, louder this time, his voice rising in panic again. I shot it right at it, point blank." He pointed at his rifle, which he was still clutching in his hand, the barrel smoking slightly. "I shot it 3 times. "And?" Elias pressed, voice tight. "What happened?" Thomas took another shuddering breath. It screamed," he said, his voice cracking again. "That scream, that awful scream, after I shot it, it just turned and ran into the woods, on 2 legs, staggering, but fast." Silence fell again in the 5th wheel. A heavy, terrified silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Finally, Jenkins spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. You shot at it? What did it look like?" "Exactly." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, like he was trying to block out the image. When he opened them, they were wet with tears, or sweat or something. I don't know," he stammered. "Hairy, dark, huge, just huge and monstrous. Its face, I couldn't see its face, just dark fur. But the eyes, I saw the eyes, glowed, yellow." He was rambling now, voice going higher and higher. "I saw it, I swear to God I saw it. Right outside the door, staring in. That scream, it was coming from that thing." Nobody said anything. What could you say? It sounded insane, complete and utter madness. But Thomas wasn't a liar, and he was genuinely terrified, more terrified than I'd ever seen anyone in my life. And we'd all heard those screams. We'd all felt that fear. The rest of the night was a blur of hushed whispers, nervous glances and sleeplessness. Nobody went outside. Nobody dared to even look out the windows for long. We stayed huddled in our trailers, listening to every tiny sound, jumping at shadows. The woods felt alive, watching us, waiting. When dawn finally broke, it was like a weight had lifted, just a little. The woods looked normal again. Well, almost normal. The air still felt heavy, charged with something unseen. As soon as it was light enough, we went outside, cautiously, guns ready. We checked the area around the 5th wheel, and we saw them. In the mud, right outside the door of Thomas's trailer, were tracks. Big tracks. Huge tracks. Even with the rain that had fallen during the night, they were clear. Deep impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any bare paw print any of us had ever seen. And strange. They were vaguely foot-shaped, but gigantic. Like a human foot, but 3 times the size. 4 toes, maybe 5, we couldn't tell exactly, but huge, thick toes. And deep heel impressions, like something incredibly heavy had stood there on 2 feet. We followed the tracks for a short distance into the woods. They led away from the camp, deeper into the trees. We didn't go far. Nobody wanted to. We saw broken branches, crushed undergrowth, signs of something huge moving through the forest in a hurry. And then the tracks just disappeared into the thicker underbrush and pine needles, like it had vanished into thin air. Nobody said a word. We all saw them, those tracks. And they weren't bear tracks, they weren't deer tracks, they weren't anything we could explain. Thomas started packing immediately. He didn't say a word, just threw his gear into his truck, hooked up the fifth wheel, and started the engine. His face was still pale, his eyes still haunted. My dad tried to talk to him. "Tom, we just got here." Thomas just shook his head, eyes darting around the woods like he expected something to jump out at him any second. "I'm done," he said, voice flat, dead. "I'm going home, and I'm never coming back to this cursed place. Ever." And that was it. He left, just like that. Drove off, tires spitting gravel, without another word. Me, my dad, Elias, Frank and Jenkins, we just stood there, watching him go, staring at the empty space where his trailer had been. We packed up too, pretty quick after that. The hunt was over. No more talk of deer or elk or anything else. We just wanted to get out of there, out of those woods, away from that thing. We never spoke about it again, not really, not in detail. We knew what we'd heard. We'd seen those tracks, and we'd seen the look on Thomas's face. It was enough. Some things are better left unspoken. I still hunt every year, but I've never gone back to those woods near Camposanto. Never will. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls or a dog barks in the distance, I hear it again in my memory. That scream, that terrifying, inhuman scream. And I see those tracks in the mud, and I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that what Uncle Thomas saw that night wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something is out there, something ancient and terrible. And I pray to God we never hear that scream again, because some things you can't unsee, and some screams you can't unhear. And that night in the woods changed us all, in ways we still can't fully explain, even after all these years. It just stopped. And that silence afterward was maybe even worse than the screaming itself. It's like the world just held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But nothing did. And that's the part that really sticks with you, the not knowing, the hanging question in the air. What was it? What happened? And why did it just stop? I guess we'll never know. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Story 15. Look, I don't usually talk about this. Not really. I mean, who would believe you? Even now, years later, it still feels like some messed up dream. But maybe putting it down somewhere people might get it, you know? It might help get it out of my head. We grew up in Villa Verde, Ohio, way out in the sticks. Back then, in the early 90s, it was even more isolated. We lived on Vista Oeste Road. Sounded fancy, right? Vista Oeste, West View. There wasn't much of a view, mostly just woods and more woods, and then the Rayburns' junkyard down the road. Our house, it wasn't really a house, it was a trailer. A double wide, but still a trailer. It was home, though. We always heard stories, whispers really, about something out in the woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it. Old-timers would talk, but quietly, like it was a secret you weren't supposed to repeat out loud. My dad, he was a believer, kind of. He wouldn't say it outright, but he'd get this look in his eyes whenever the subject came up, like he knew something he wasn't sharing. Mom, she'd roll her eyes, call it nonsense, but I saw her flinch sometimes at night when a branch snapped outside. Us kids, me and my two younger brothers, we soaked it all up. It was like a scary campfire story, but it was our woods, our backyard. It started subtle, the weird stuff. Just noises at first. Wood knocks, they call them now. We didn't know what to call them then. Just loud bangs like someone was hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat, but always late at night. Then the howling started. Not like a coyote. Deeper, louder, more human-sounding, but twisted. It'd make the hair on your neck stand up, make your blood run cold. We'd be in bed, in our little rooms at the back of the trailer, and we'd hear it echoing through the trees. We'd pull the covers over our heads, pretending we were brave, but we were all scared shitless. One night, I was probably 10 or 11, we were all asleep when something slammed against the side of the trailer. Not just a thump, but a bone-jarring, trailer-shaking slam. We all woke up screaming. It was like something massive had just run into us. Then we heard scraping, dragging noises, and another huge bang. The whole trailer seemed to jump. Dad yelled for us to stay in our rooms. We could hear him and Mom moving around in the front whispering. Then the trailer shifted, seriously shifted. We were suddenly at an angle. It was like being on a boat in a storm. We were yelling for Mom and Dad, terrified. They came rushing back, faces white as ghosts. The trailer had actually slipped off its blocks. The end of it was hanging, tilted. Something had hit us hard enough to knock us off the foundation. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, listening to every creak and groan of the trailer, every rustle outside. Dad went out in the morning to try and see what had happened, armed with his shotgun. He came back looking grim. He said he didn't see anything, no tracks or anything obvious. But the block was definitely knocked sideways, and there were these deep gouges in the dirt underneath the trailer, like something really heavy had slid against it. He didn't say Bigfoot, but he didn't have to. We all knew. After that, things got more intense. It wasn't just noises anymore. It was like they were getting closer, bolder. A few weeks after the trailer shifting, it happened again. We were playing cards in the kitchen, just a normal night. Mum was making coffee. My brothers, Mark and Danny, they were bickering like always. Dad was trying to teach me poker. It was maybe 10:30 at night, something like that. Suddenly, I got this feeling, this prickling feeling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I don't know why, but I turned around and looked out the window behind me, and that's when I saw it. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. Just outside the window, maybe 10 feet away, crouched down in the shadows, was this thing. It was huge, dark, covered in thick matted fur. It was hunched over, almost like it was trying to hide, but it was so massive it was impossible, and it was staring right at me. Eyes. That's what I remember most. Its eyes. They were big, round, and they glowed in the dark, not like animal eyes reflecting light. These were like they had their own light source behind them. Bright, piercing, yellowy white. They bored right into me. I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. I just stared back at it, paralyzed with terror. I think my face must have changed because everyone stopped talking and looked at me. Dad said, "Sean, what's wrong?" I couldn't get words out. I just pointed at the window, my hand shaking so bad I could barely keep it up. Everyone turned. For a second, they didn't see anything. Then Mom gasped. Dad swore under his breath. Even my little brothers went quiet, their eyes wide with fear. It was still there, crouched in the dark, staring. We all just stood there, looking at it, and it looked right back at us. It was like time stopped. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. We were just locked in this silent standoff with this monster. Then, slowly, it started to stand up. It unfolded itself like some kind of nightmare creature in a horror movie. It just kept getting taller and taller. Its head cleared the top of the window frame. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, and thick, incredibly thick and muscular. It was covered head to toe in dark fur except for its face. I couldn't really see its face clearly in the shadows, but those eyes, those glowing eyes were unmistakable. It stood there for what felt like forever, just looming over us. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked away. Walked, not ran, just turned and casually walked into the woods. We watched it go, watched it disappear into the trees. Nobody said a word. We were all too shocked, too scared. After it was gone, Dad finally broke the silence. He whispered, Did you all see that?" We all nodded, still speechless. Mum started to cry. Danny was whimpering. Mark was just staring at the window, his eyes still huge. Dad grabbed his shotgun, went to the door and slowly opened it. He looked out into the yard, shining the porch light around. Nothing. Just the dark woods, silent except for the crickets. He went outside, walked around the trailer, looking, listening. He was out there for a while, then he came back in, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. "Just nothing." That night, none of us slept properly. We all stayed in the living room, lights on, huddled together. Every little sound made us jump. We kept looking out the windows, expecting it to come back. It didn't. But the fear, that cold, paralyzing fear, it stayed with us. The next night was even worse. We were all on edge, jumpy. Dad had boarded up the windows in the back of the trailer, the ones facing the woods, just in case. We tried to act normal, tried to watch TV, but nobody could concentrate. Every time a branch cracked outside, we'd all flinch. We were living in a pressure cooker of anxiety. It was maybe around 9 or 10 p.m. We were just sitting there in the living room, the TV on low, nobody really watching it, just staring into space. Suddenly we heard noises outside again, rustling in the bushes, twigs snapping. We all froze. This time, it wasn't just distant sounds, it was right outside, close. Then we heard footsteps, heavy footsteps, pounding the ground, coming closer to the trailer. Dad grabbed his shotgun again. Mom pulled us kids closer to her. We could hear something moving around outside, circling the trailer. Heavy breathing, grunting sounds, the kind of sounds that made your stomach churn. Then, it stopped right outside the front door. We all held our breath, listening. Silent, dead silent for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then, a loud, deep growl right outside the door. It vibrated through the wood, through the whole trailer. It was terrifying. Dad slowly moved towards the door, shotgun raised. He motioned for us to stay back. He was going to look. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. He took a deep breath and yanked the door open. And there it was, standing right in front of the trailer, bathed in the pale moonlight, even bigger than we'd seen it the night before. Its head was up by the roof of the trailer. It was massive, imposing. Its silhouette against the moonlight was just monstrous. 6 of us, Dad, Mom, me, Mark, Danny, even Grandma Hurley, who lived with us, we all stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring up at it. It didn't move. It just stood there, looking down at us, silent, powerful. Its sheer size, the darkness of its fur, the way it loomed over us, it was like something out of a nightmare made real. We were paralyzed with fear, completely and utterly frozen. Nobody could scream, nobody could run, nobody could even blink. We just stared. It stood there for a long time, maybe only a minute or two, but it felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its head. Not away from us, but just tilted its head to the side like it was curious, examining us. And then, just as slowly, it turned back, faced forward, and walked away. Again, just walked. No rush, no fear. It just turned and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Dad lowered his shotgun, his face white as a sheet. He closed the door slowly, quietly. He leaned against it, his breathing heavy. We were all just standing there, in shock, silent again. The next few weeks were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every night was a nightmare. We jumped at every noise, every shadow. We felt like we were being watched constantly. We didn't go outside after dark. We kept all the doors locked, all the windows closed. Dad started sleeping with his shotgun by his bed. Mom was a nervous wreck. We were all living on edge, waiting for something to happen again. And it did. It always did. One night, it started raining stones. Not little pebbles, rocks. Good-sized rocks, thudding against the side of the trailer, banging on the roof. It was loud, violent, terrifying. It sounded like the trailer was being bombarded. We huddled together in the middle of the living room, scared to death. Dad grabbed his flashlight this time, along with the shotgun. He was angry now, as well as scared. He said, "That's it. I'm going to see what the hell is out there." Mom tried to stop him, begging him to stay inside, but he was done hiding. He threw open the front door and stepped out into the night, shining the flashlight around the yard. The rocks were still coming down, hitting the trailer, the ground around him. And then he saw it. He froze. The flashlight beam locked on something in the yard. We were all right behind him in the doorway, peering out, and there it was, sitting, just sitting there, on a fallen log in our yard, calm as you please, in the beam of Dad's flashlight. It was the Bigfoot, the monster, whatever you wanted to call it, sitting on a log like it was taking a break. It was just watching the trailer, watching us. The rocks were still falling, but it was like it wasn't even bothered by them. And those eyes, they were glowing in the flashlight beam, that same eerie yellowy white burning into us. It sat there for a moment, bathed in the flashlight beam, just staring. Then, slowly, deliberately, it picked up a rock from the ground, a good-sized rock, and just tossed it. Not threw it hard, just gently tossed it at the trailer. It hit the side of the trailer with a loud thud. Then it just sat back down on the log and looked at us again. It was like it was saying, "Yeah, I'm here, and there's nothing you can do about it." Dad stood there for a second, frozen flashlight beam still locked on the creature. Then something in him snapped. He roared, a primal, angry roar, and he charged. He ran right at it, yelling, waving the shotgun. I thought he was crazy. I thought he was going to get himself killed. But he just charged. The Bigfoot didn't even flinch. It just watched him coming. Dad got within maybe 20 feet of it, still yelling, and then, in one fluid motion, the Bigfoot stood up. It unfolded itself again, towering over Dad, and then it just turned and walked into the woods. Slowly, calmly, just walked away. Dad stopped, panting, still holding the shotgun, watching it go. He didn't chase it. He just stood there, staring into the darkness, breathing heavily. He came back inside, his face pale but set. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he just shook his head and said, It's just showing off. It's just letting us know it's there." We were all shaking, terrified, but also, strangely, a little relieved that Dad hadn't gotten hurt. The rock throwing stopped after that. That night, at least. It wasn't always at night, though. That's what people don't realize. It wasn't just some nocturnal creature. They were around during the day, too. One afternoon, me and my brothers were walking down Vista Oeste Road, towards the Rayburn's junkyard. It was probably around 6:30 in the evening, still daylight, but getting duskier. We were just messing around, kicking rocks, talking about baseball cards, normal kid stuff. We were walking along the side of the road next to the woods when we heard something in the trees, rustling, snapping branches, but louder, heavier than just a deer or something. We stopped walking and listened. The sounds were getting closer to the road, moving through the woods parallel to us. We got this really bad feeling, like that gut-wrenching, ice-cold fear. We started walking faster, wanting to get back to the trailer. Then we saw it. It crashed out of the woods, right onto the side of the road, maybe 50 feet in front of us. It was huge, dark, hairy. The Bigfoot. It was standing there, blocking the road, looking right at us. And then 2 more of them came crashing out of the woods behind it. 3 of them, standing there on the side of the road. 3 monstrous, hairy creatures staring us down. We didn't think. We just ran. We turned and bolted, screaming, running as fast as we could back towards the trailer. I remember looking back over my shoulder, and they were moving, running towards us. Not chasing us full speed, but definitely moving towards us. We ran like hell. We ran faster than we'd ever run in our lives. We ran all the way back to the trailer, burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us, locking it, screaming for Dad. He came running, shotgun in hand, looking terrified. We were babbling, trying to tell him what we'd seen. 3 of them on the road, running at us. He looked at us, his face grim. He grabbed his rifle too. He went to the window, peering out, looking down Vista Oeste Road. He didn't see anything. They were gone. But we knew what we'd seen. 3 of them, in broad daylight. After that, we started finding things in the woods behind our trailer. Dad took us back there, armed, to try and see if we could find any sign of them. We found broken trees, twisted and snapped like toothpicks. We found these weird structures made of bent branches and woven vines, kind of like giant nests. We called them nests. They were huge, big enough for something massive to sleep in. We found caves, dark holes in the hillside that we'd never noticed before. And tracks. Giant footprints in the mud, bigger than our feet, bigger than Dad's feet, human-shaped but wrong. Too big, too wide, too deep. And the sounds, the nights were filled with them. The howls, the screams, the wood knocks, the heavy footsteps, the rustling in the bushes. It was like they were everywhere, all around us, watching us, surrounding us. We were living in a constant state of terror. We were trapped. We eventually moved. Couldn't take it anymore. Dad got a job in another town, said it was for better opportunities. But we all knew why we were really leaving. We never talked about it much after that. Tried to forget, but you don't forget something like that. You can't just erase that kind of fear from your memory. Sometimes, late at night, when it's quiet, I still hear those sounds in my head.